The freezing autumn rain hammered the Boston streets with relentless precision, soaking through the thin fabric of my olive green trench coat and chilling my skin down to the absolute bone. Every frantic step I took on the uneven cobblestones sent a sharp, agonizing jolt of pain up my calves, a physical reminder of the sheer exhaustion that had been building inside me for the past 6 months. I could hear the distant, muffled blare of traffic on the main avenue, the normal world carrying on oblivious to my terror, but the narrow, historic alleyway I was currently navigating felt entirely disconnected from the rest of the civilized city, suffocated by the encroaching, predatory shadows. The wet brick walls seemed to close in around me, amplifying the sound of my ragged breathing until it sounded like a siren in the dark. I kept running. I had perfected the art of being invisible over the last year, learning exactly how to shrink my posture, how to mute my footsteps, and how to blend into the gray background of a busy street. But tonight, invisibility was no longer enough. Richard Thorne was hunting me. My ex-husband wasn't a monster who lurked in dark corners wearing a ski mask. He was a highly respected, corrupt financial auditor who wore perfectly tailored suits, possessed a charming, white-toothed smile, and donated generously to local charities. He destroyed independent businesses on paper, manipulated corporate ledgers with a terrifying, clinical detachment, and broke bones in the absolute, soundproofed privacy of our former home. I clutched my side, my freezing fingers pressing against the damp fabric of my blouse, feeling the sharp, blooming ache where his heavy grip had bruised my ribs just an hour ago when he ambushed me outside my apartment. He had demanded my silence regarding his illicit offshore accounts, his voice low and cultured, perfectly modulated even as his manicured fingers dug into my flesh like iron clamps. I had managed to break free, acting on pure, desperate adrenaline to blind him momentarily, with a spray of scalding coffee from my travel mug, but the head start I had gained was rapidly evaporating. He was methodical. He never stopped until the ledger was balanced. My lungs burned with the sharp, acidic sting of the frigid New England air as I desperately scanned the historic Beacon Hill architecture for any sign of a public sanctuary. As a historical architectural conservator, my brain, automatically, almost pathologically, categorized the buildings around me, instinctively cataloging the 19th century Federalist brickwork, the dissolving limestone cornices, fighting a losing battle against acid rain, and the wrought iron gas lamps that flickered weakly in the tempest. Under normal circumstances, I would have stopped to admire the intricate masonry, running my trained fingers over the weathered stone to assess its structural integrity and historical value. I knew the chemical composition of the mortar holding these streets together better than I knew the people who walked on them. Tonight, however, the towering structures were merely unyielding obstacles in a terrifying, freezing labyrinth, cold and completely indifferent to the terrified woman sprinting past them. The sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoed off the brick walls somewhere behind me, precise and unhurried. Richard, panic, cold and suffocating, seized my throat, threatening to shut down my airway completely. I darted around a sharp corner, the wet leather of my boots skidding dangerously on the slick, rain-washed pavement, and practically collided with a massive, imposing structure that seemed to rise out of the storm like an ancient, impenetrable fortress. It was a grand Catholic cathedral, a stunning, breathtaking example of Gothic revival architecture, complete with towering spires that pierced the low-hanging, turbulent clouds and heavy-flying buttresses that anchored it firmly to the earth. The intricate, massive rose window above the main entrance was dark, but warm golden light spilled invitingly from the narrow stained glass panels flanking the enormous wooden doors. A public sanctuary. If I could just get inside among the late-night congregants or tourists seeking shelter from the storm, my abuser wouldn't dare cause a scene in a crowded, holy place. He relied entirely on the meticulously crafted illusion of his pristine corporate reputation. He would never risk witnesses. I dragged my exhausted, shivering body up the wide granite steps, the stone biting into the thin soles of my boots, my hands trembling violently as I reached for the heavy brass handle of the side entrance door. The metal was freezing to the touch, slick with the driving rain and the condensation of the autumn night, but I gripped it with every remaining ounce of my fading, desperate strength. I expected it to be locked, bracing myself for the devastating final click of an unyielding mechanism that would trap me outside with my tormentor. But the heavy oak gave way smoothly under my desperate push. The hinges, perfectly oiled and meticulously maintained, made absolutely no sound as the massive door swung inward, revealing a sliver of warm, incense-scented air that contrasted sharply with the bitter, howling storm outside. I threw myself into the narrow gap, my shoulders scraping against the ancient wood, and pulled the heavy door shut behind me, until the latch clicked into place with a heavy, definitive thud. Safe, or so I thought. I leaned my back against the solid oak, pressing my damp spine into the unyielding surface, closing my eyes as I fought to control my ragged, desperate breathing, inhaling the familiar, comforting scent of melting beeswax, old paper, and rich myrrh. For a fleeting second, the profound silence of the cathedral wrapped around me like a familiar, suffocating blanket, offering a deceptive, intoxicating illusion of absolute security. The rain outside was instantly reduced to a distant, meaningless murmur, blocked out by 3 feet of solid historic stone that had withstood centuries of brutal Boston winters. But as my heart rate began to slow down from a frantic sprint to a heavy, painful thud, the primal instincts that had kept me alive during my marriage to the auditor began to scream at me. The silence in the massive sanctuary was not empty. It was heavy, pressurized, and hummed with the quiet, lethal tension of a drawn blade. I opened my eyes, blinking away the freezing rainwater that stung my lashes, and finally looked at the sanctuary I had just invaded. The transition from the chaotic, freezing violence of the Boston streets to the immaculate, pristine interior of the cathedral was so jarring it momentarily fractured my senses. I had expected to find a scattering of late-night worshippers seeking quiet refuge, or perhaps a solitary caretaker in faded overalls, sweeping the polished marble floors. But the reality before me was fundamentally, terrifyingly different. The massive nave of the church was awash in the golden, ethereal glow of hundreds of lit candles, their flickering light casting long, dancing shadows against the intricate ribbed vaulting of the 80-foot ceiling. But the long wooden pews were completely empty of ordinary civilians. Instead, the perimeter of the grand space was lined with men. They were not tourists, and they were certainly not seeking spiritual salvation. There were at least 30 of them, tall, broad-shouldered figures standing in absolute, statuesque silence along the outer aisles, wearing bespoke dark suits that cost more than my entire annual salary. They didn't move, they didn't whisper to one another, and they didn't even shift their weight. But the moment the side door had clicked shut behind me, every single pair of cold, calculating eyes in the room had locked onto my dripping, disheveled form. The atmosphere shifted instantly, growing infinitely heavier and lethally focused, like a predator had just revealed itself, and every prey animal in the vicinity suddenly remembered what fear tasted like. Only I wasn't the predator. I was the bleeding, exhausted prey that had just stumbled blindly, foolishly, directly into a den of wolves. My gaze was drawn inexorably down the long, blood-red carpeted central aisle, past the rows of silent, armed sentinels who watched me with dead eyes, toward the magnificent high altar at the front of the sanctuary. Standing there, illuminated by the radiant heavenly glow of the golden tabernacle and flanked by towering banks of white orchids, was Father Thomas Aldridge. The elderly priest looked visibly terrified, his frail hands gripping the velvet-lined ledger so tightly his knuckles were completely white, a thick bead of sweat tracing the deep, anxious lines of his weathered forehead, despite the cool draft in the massive room. But he wasn't the reason the air in the cathedral felt so incredibly thin. The reason was the man standing directly in front of him, Dante DeLuca. Even from a distance of 50 yards, the sovereign leader of the DeLuca syndicate commanded the massive, historic space with a terrifying, effortless authority that made my own abusive ex-husband look like a petty, insignificant child throwing a tantrum. He was exceptionally tall, his broad shoulders encased in an immaculate, razor-sharp black tuxedo that spoke of generations of old money, violent power, and absolute command. He stood completely still, his posture rigid and formal, yet radiating a dark, coiled energy that warned of catastrophic violence lying just beneath the civilized, polished surface. As the heavy, intrusive echo of my uninvited entrance settled into the cavernous room, the mafia boss slowly turned his head away from the nervous clergyman and looked directly at me. I stopped breathing entirely. His irises were a tempestuous slate, cold and deep and entirely unreadable, pinning me to the massive oak door with the sheer physical force of his gaze. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, wrapping around my throat like a velvet garrote, as he took in the pathetic sight of my soaked, muddy boots staining the pristine, meticulously polished marble floor, my dripping olive green coat, and the violent purple bruises already blossoming with terrifying speed around my pale wrists. I wanted to apologize, to scramble backward, to push the heavy iron-wrought handle of the door open, and throw myself back into the freezing storm where Richard was waiting. But my limbs refused to obey my frantic neural commands. The terrifying truth crashed over me. I had accidentally crashed a highly secured, heavily guarded private syndicate wedding. There was no bride visible anywhere near the grand altar, no rustle of white silk, no nervous bridesmaids. Only a tense vacant space beside the powerful leader, suggesting a catastrophic disruption had occurred long before I ever walked through the door. The single word scratched its way out of my burning throat, sounding embarrassingly small, broken and pathetic in the vast, acoustically perfect echoing chamber. I pressed my back harder against the cold wood, my heart hammering against my ribs so violently, I thought it might actually fracture the fragile bone. The underboss, Marco Moretti, standing near the front pew in a charcoal suit, and possessing a face that looked like it had been violently carved from unyielding granite, immediately slid his right hand inside his tailored jacket. The threat was explicit, terrifyingly fluid, and lethally professional. But before the underboss could draw his weapon and end my miserable existence, Dante raised a single leather-gloved hand. The gesture was minimal, requiring almost zero physical effort, a mere flick of the wrist. Yet it carried the absolute, crushing weight of a sovereign decree. The man in the charcoal suit froze instantly, a statue forged from obedience, his hand remaining hidden inside his jacket, his dead eyes remaining locked on me with cold, detached hostility. No one in the massive cathedral breathed. Not a single person moved a muscle. The entire criminal empire, gathered in the sacred candlelit space for a ceremony of supreme importance, waited in total, breathless silence for their boss to dictate my fate. Dante slowly stepped down from the elevated marble altar, his highly polished dress shoes making absolutely no sound as he began to walk down the central aisle toward me. Every single step he took was measured, deliberate, and terrifyingly calm, methodically stripping away the distance between my exhausted, shivering body and his overwhelming, magnetic presence. I stared at the man approaching me, my architectural conservator mind bizarrely, desperately attempting to anchor itself, by noting the precise mathematical symmetry of his facial features, the harsh, uncompromising angle of his jaw, and the deep, permanent shadows beneath his intense stare that spoke of sleepless nights and ruthless calculations. He wasn't just a dangerous man in an expensive suit. He was the architecture of power itself, a living, breathing fortress built on a foundation of ruthlessness, loyalty, and absolute control. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me, close enough that the frigid chill of the rain clinging to my skin was suddenly overpowered by his immense contained body heat. I could suddenly smell the faint, intoxicating scent of expensive cedar, crisp winter air, and fine bourbon, a scent that short-circuited my panic and replaced it with a paralyzing, irrational awe. The sheer physical size of him blocked out the rest of the cathedral, casting me completely in his dark, protective shadow, shielding me from the 30 pairs of eyes still burning into my back. I tilted my head back, my wet hair clinging miserably to my icy neck, and forced myself to meet his piercing gaze locking onto mine, bracing myself for the violence I had come to expect from powerful men. I expected anger. I expected to be dragged out into the dark alley by my hair and disposed of for interrupting a sacred syndicate ritual. Instead, his striking look dropping to my bruised wrists observed the stark, brutal contrast of the deep purple contusions against my pale, freezing skin. A muscle near his sharp jaw twitched, a minuscule, almost imperceptible fracture in his stoic, unreadable facade. He didn't ask who I was, or what pathetic series of events had led me here. He didn't demand to know how I had bypassed the outer perimeter security, or why I was bleeding dirty water onto the historic floor of his church. He didn't raise his voice to berate me for ruining his immaculate suit with my proximity. He simply looked back up, his storm-gray eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the surrounding cold completely, instantly vanish. "You are shaking," the mafia boss stated quietly. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that vibrated straight through my aching chest, possessing a strange, hypnotic cadence that demanded absolute truth. I made a mistake," I whispered frantically, my voice cracking under the immense, crushing weight of the situation, the adrenaline finally leaving my system and leaving behind only pure, unadulterated terror. "I didn't mean to intrude." There is a man outside. My ex-husband, he. I couldn't finish the sentence. The overwhelming exhaustion, the physical pain of my bruised ribs, and the paralyzing fear finally breaking my last defensive barrier. My throat closed up tight. I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting the harsh, inevitable reality of consequence to strike me down, expecting the cold metal of Marco's gun or the brutal impact of a fist. Instead of a weapon, I felt the sudden, shocking weight of a bespoke cashmere jacket settling over my freezing-soaked shoulders. The material was impossibly soft and heavy, retaining the intense, comforting body heat of the man standing before me, wrapping around me like a physical shield against the hostile world. My eyes flew open in absolute, breathless shock. Dante DeLuca was standing before me in merely his crisp white dress shirt, his dark suspenders stark and severe against the tailored fabric, his large, capable hands calmly adjusting the lapels of his own expensive jacket around my shivering frame. He didn't touch my bruised skin, maintaining a rigid, deeply respectful boundary even as he enveloped me entirely in his scent and his overwhelming protection. The contrast between Richard's violent, grabbing hands and this man's precise, careful restraint made a tear finally spill over my icy lashes. "Father Thomas," Dante called out, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the silent, echoing nave without him ever breaking eye contact with me, his slate irises holding mine hostage. "Yes, Mr. DeLuca." The elderly priest answered quickly, his voice trembling slightly as it echoed from the distant altar, the sound of the velvet-lined ledger, snapping shut echoing like a gunshot. The sovereign protector looked down at me, his flinty gaze dropping once more to the brutal bruises on my wrist, his jaw tightening fractionally, before his eyes returned to my terrified, confused face. The storm outside hammered fiercely against the stained glass windows, a violent, chaotic reminder of the corrupt financial auditor waiting for me in the dark alleyway, ready to drag me back into a life of pain and forced compliance. But inside this pressurized, gilded cage surrounded by lethal men in expensive suits, I felt an entirely different kind of gravity taking hold. A gravity built on dangerous promises and absolute authority. Dante's jaw set into a hard, uncompromising line, a decision made in the silent gravity of the sacred space. He stepped even closer, effectively boxing me in between the heavy oak door and his towering, immovable frame. "The woman who was supposed to be standing at that altar tonight has made a fatal error in judgment and disappeared," Dante stated, his voice a low, gravelly murmur, meant for my ears alone. The admission was startling in its bluntness, stripped of any emotion or wounded pride. It was merely a tactical fact, delivered by a man who calculated human lives like chess pieces. "My syndicate requires a wedding to be witnessed tonight to solidify a necessary transition of power. You require a fortress to keep whoever put those marks on your skin from ever touching you again." My breath hitched, my architectural conservator's mind instantly recognizing the structural integrity of the deal he was constructing. It was a transaction, a terrifying monumental trade of debts. "I don't even know you," I managed to whisper, clutching the edges of his cashmere jacket like a lifeline. The scent of aged whiskey and crisp winter air enveloped me, grounding my frantic nerves. "You know that I am the only man in this city who can make your abuser disappear without a trace," Dante countered softly, his unyielding focus dropping to my bruised wrists once more, before locking onto my gaze with terrifying possession. "Stand at that altar with me. Become my wife in front of my men. I will give you my absolute protection, the full weight of the DeLuca name, and a sanctuary where no one will ever lay a violent hand on you again." The stained glass windows rattled under a brutal gust of wind, a violent reminder of Richard, prowling the streets outside, tallying up his perceived slights, preparing to break my spirit entirely. I looked past the imposing dawn, my eyes tracing the long, blood-red carpet leading to the golden tabernacle, the silent ranks of armed sentinels waiting for their sovereign's command, and Father Thomas standing nervously, with the velvet-lined ledger. It was madness. It was stepping out of a domestic nightmare, and directly into the epicenter of the criminal underworld. But as Dante lifted his gloved hand and gently, almost reverently, brushed a wet strand of hair away from my freezing cheek, a touch so restrained it sent a jolt of electric shock straight down my spine, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was making a choice. "Are you asking me to be your fake bride?" My voice trembled, but this time, not from the cold. "I am offering you a crown, Clara," he corrected seamlessly, though I hadn't even given him my name yet. The fact that he already knew it was a chilling testament to the absolute reach of his power. "Now, walk with me." And heaven help me, I took his offered arm, stepping out of the freezing shadows and into the blinding, terrifying light of the DeLuca Empire. The first step felt like crossing an invisible, irreversible threshold. My wet leather boots made a soft, pathetic squelching sound against the immaculately polished marble floor, a glaring contrast to the silent, predatory glide of the man walking beside me. I clung to his offered arm, my frozen fingers digging desperately into the fine, dark fabric of his sleeve, anchoring myself to the only solid object in a world that had suddenly tilted completely off its axis. The bespoke cashmere jacket he had draped over my trembling shoulders was overwhelmingly heavy, smelling of rain bourbon and a dark, dangerous kind of power. It retained the intense, localized heat of his body, a phantom embrace that began to slowly thaw the icy terror gripping my chest. I was walking down the central aisle of a magnificent sanctuary, escorted not by a proud father, but by a sovereign protector, who had just casually offered to erase the architect of my nightmares from the face of the earth. As an architectural conservator, my entire professional life was dedicated to understanding how things were built, analyzing load-bearing walls, identifying structural stress points, and reinforcing crumbling foundations. I knew how to save historic buildings from collapse, but I had failed utterly to recognize the structural rot in my own marriage until the ceiling had caved in on me. Richard had built our life together on a foundation of isolation and meticulously calculated abuse, distancing me from my peers, controlling my finances, and masking his violent outbursts behind a veneer of corporate respectability. He had fractured my self-worth just as methodically as he manipulated the illicit ledgers he audited for his corrupt clients. I had spent the last year desperately trying to shore up the collapsing walls of my own sanity, running, hiding, trying to be invisible. Now, leaning against the unyielding, muscular arm of the mafia boss, I realized I was abandoning the old, broken structure entirely. I was stepping into a fortress. It might be forged from dark money, violence, and criminal loyalty, but it was solid stone. And right now, I needed stone. The 30 armed sentinels lining the perimeter of the grand nave did not look away as we moved past them. Their collective gaze was a physical weight, cold and calculating, assessing every dripping, disheveled inch of me. They noted the damp, ruined state of my olive-green trench coat, the chaotic tangle of my wet hair, and the stark, ugly purple bruises circling my left wrist. I instinctively tried to shrink inward, a conditioned trauma response demanding I hide my injuries to avoid further punishment. But the man beside me would not allow it. He didn't speak, he didn't adjust his grip, but a subtle, demanding shift in his rigid posture forced me to stand taller. His unspoken command was absolute. Do not cower. Not while you are with me. The atmosphere in the cathedral was suffocatingly thick, heavy with the scent of melting beeswax and the sharp, metallic tang of suppressed violence. Every single man in the room knew that a catastrophic failure had occurred tonight. The original woman who was supposed to be walking down this blood-red carpet had vanished, a betrayal that should have resulted in massive syndicate embarrassment and brutal retaliation. Instead, their leader was calmly escorting a bruised, soaked stranger toward the Golden Tabernacle. The tension was a living, breathing entity in the vast acoustic space, winding tight around the towering limestone columns. Halfway down the aisle, Dante suddenly stopped. The abrupt halt sent a ripple of acute anxiety through my exhausted body, my heart hammering wildly against my bruised ribs. The entire perimeter of suited men froze in tandem, the silence deepening into something profound and terrifying. The sovereign leader slowly turned his head, releasing my arm for a fraction of a second to adjust the lapels of his crisp white dress shirt, his furious stare sweeping over his assembled soldiers. He did not look angry. He did not look embarrassed. He looked utterly terrifyingly in control. The parameters of Tad's arrangement have fundamentally changed. His deep, resonant baritone echoed through the ribbed vaulting of the 80-foot ceiling, bouncing off the stained glass windows and filling every dark corner of the church. He didn't raise his voice, yet the sheer commanding authority in his tone demanded absolute submission. The previous alliance proved unworthy of our family's legacy. The woman who fled has sealed her own fate. That matter will be handled discreetly, permanently. A collective, microscopic shift occurred among the men, a tightening of jaws, a lowering of chins. They understood the lethal implication of that statement. However, Dante continued, his gaze returning to me, the coldness in his eyes melting just a fraction as he looked at my pale, shivering face. The transition of power must be solidified tonight. The DeLuca Empire does not halt for the cowardice of others. He reached out, his large, capable hand gently taking my bruised wrist. He was incredibly careful, his thumb resting securely on the unblemished skin of my palm, avoiding the deep purple contusions entirely. He lifted my hand slightly, presenting me to the room. This is Clara. She has sought sanctuary within our walls. In exchange, she will stand beside me. She is under my direct absolute protection. Any disrespect shown to her will be treated as an act of war against myself. He didn't ask for their approval. He dictated the new reality, bending the entire criminal organization to his will through sheer force of presence. Marco, standing near the front pew, slowly unbuttoned his charcoal suit jacket and gave a single respectful nod. The gesture rippled around the room, a silent, unified wave of acceptance. The threat of syndicate embarrassment was instantly extinguished, replaced by a chilling display of absolute loyalty. I stared at the man beside me, my mind reeling from the magnitude of what had just happened. With a few calculated sentences, he had taken a terrified, bleeding woman, who had stumbled into his church by mistake, and elevated her to a position of untouchable power. He turned back to me, offering his arm once more. "Breathe," he commanded softly, a private instruction hidden beneath the public spectacle. I exhaled a shaky breath I hadn't realized I was holding, the acidic sting of the cold air finally leaving my lungs. I took his arm again, and together, we closed the remaining distance to the altar. The high altar was a masterpiece of ecclesiastical architecture, bathed in the radiant, heavenly glow of hundreds of flickering candles. The massive banks of white orchids flanking the golden tabernacle looked surreal and pristine against the dark, violent context of the gathering. The air here was warmer, saturated with the rich, heavy perfume of the flowers and the ancient smoky scent of incense. But the overwhelming beauty of the sanctuary was entirely lost on Father Thomas Aldridge. The elderly clergyman was visibly trembling, his frail frame shrinking inside his ornate liturgical vestments. He looked from the towering mafia boss to my bruised, disheveled form. His eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and deep, abiding fear. His knuckles were bone white as he clutched the velvet-lined ledger against his chest, the heavy, gold-embossed leather register, seemingly serving as his only physical anchor to reality. He had undoubtedly prepared a grand solemn ceremony for a high society syndicate merger, expecting a pristine diamond-draped bride. Instead, he was being asked to bind the most dangerous man in the city to a soaking wet, shivering fugitive wearing a borrowed jacket over a stained blouse. "Father," Dante said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet register that was somehow more intimidating than a shout. "We are ready. Keep it brief." "Yes, Mr. DeLuca," the priest stammered, frantically setting the heavy register down on the marble altar. His hands shook so badly he nearly knocked over a golden chalice. He fumbled to open the book, the thick parchment pages rustling loudly in the tense silence. I will omit the mass. We will proceed directly to the vows." I stood perfectly still, the surreal nature of the moment washing over me in cold, numbing waves. Outside these thick stone walls, Richard was still prowling the freezing Boston streets, frantically searching the alleyways, calculating his next move to destroy me. He would check the subway stations, the late-night diners, the hospital emergency rooms. He would never, in his wildest, most arrogant dreams, imagine that his desperate ex-wife was currently standing at the high altar of a Gothic cathedral, participating in a highly classified syndicate wedding. The dramatic irony of it tasted sharp and metallic on my tongue. I was hiding in plain sight, shielded by a monster to escape a demon. Father Thomas cleared his throat, his voice cracking as he began to recite the ancient, sacred words. The Latin phrases echoed through the massive chamber, solemn and completely detached from the transactional reality of our arrangement. I listened to the vows, the promises of fidelity, honor and protection in sickness and in health. When I had married the financial auditor 5 years ago in a sunlit country club surrounded by smiling friends, I had believed every single word. I had believed in love, in partnership, in safety. It had taken exactly 6 months for the smiles to fade, for the isolation to begin, and for the first set of bruises to bloom across my collarbone. Now, standing in a dark, candlelit church surrounded by armed criminals, I was taking those same vows again. But this time there were no illusions. There was no romance, no naive hope of a fairy tale ending. It was a calculated, desperate trade, my temporary cooperation for his absolute violence. Yet, as the sovereign protector stood beside me, his massive frame immovable and steady, His deep gaze locked onto the nervous priest with unwavering focus. I felt a strange, profound sense of relief settling into my bones. He wasn't lying to me. He wasn't pretending to be a good man. He was exactly what he appeared to be. Ruthless, stoic, and absolute. And right now, that was the safest thing in the entire world. "Do you, Dante, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the clergyman asked, his voice trembling as he looked up at the towering figure. "I do," he answered instantly. There was no hesitation, no inflection of doubt. The two words sounded like a heavy steel door slamming shut, locking the rest of the world out. "Do you?" the priest faltered, realizing he did not actually know my full name. He looked at me helplessly, a bead of sweat trickling down his pale, wrinkled temple. "Clara Sterling," I whispered, the name feeling foreign on my own tongue. My abuser had tried so hard to erase it, to reduce me to an extension of his own ego, a mere asset on his meticulously audited spreadsheet. Saying it out loud in this sacred, terrifying space felt like an act of defiance. "Do you, Clara Sterling, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" I looked up at the man beside me. His jaw was set, his expression a mask of beautiful, terrifying stone. But as my eyes met his, I saw a flicker of something deeply human beneath the cold surface. A silent acknowledgement of my terror, a quiet reassurance of his promise. He was offering me a fortress. All I had to do was step inside and let him lock the gates. "I do," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was a quiet, definitive statement of survival. "The rings," Father Thomas requested nervously, his gaze darting between us. There had been no time to prepare. The original bride's ring was likely gone with her, or completely inappropriate for the current situation. I expected him to simply bypass the tradition, to order the clergyman to finalize the paperwork without the symbolic gesture. Instead, Dante reached into the inner pocket of his dark tuxedo. He did not ask the underboss or any of his men for assistance. He produced a small, heavy object that caught the flickering candlelight, casting a deep, mesmerizing glint of green across the marble altar. It was the syndicate's antique jewel, the physical embodiment of the family's sovereign shield. "Give me your hand," he murmured, turning to fully face me. I slowly raised my left arm from beneath the folds of the heavy coat. My fingers were still trembling slightly, the skin pale and completely drained of blood from the cold and the shock. The violent purple fingerprints the auditor had left, circling my wrist, were a glaring, ugly testament to my vulnerability, a map of trauma displayed under the holy lights. I waited for the inevitable flinch, for the disgust or pity to cross his face as he confronted the physical evidence of my weakness. But the mafia boss didn't show pity. He showed quiet, terrifying rage. His sharp vision locked onto the bruises for a long, agonizing second, the muscle in his jaw twitching violently, before he smoothed his expression back into unreadable granite. He took my hand in his. His touch was shockingly warm, his large, calloused fingers wrapping around my palm with a firm, deliberate gentleness that completely bypassed the injured, sensitive skin of my wrist. The sheer control it took for a man capable of extreme violence to touch me so carefully sent a profound, aching shiver straight to my core. He slid the antique gold band onto my ring finger. The metal was heavy and cold against my skin, the raw emerald resting massively against my knuckle. It was entirely too large for my slender hand, a tangible reminder that I was wearing a crown meant for someone else, or perhaps a shield designed for a much larger war. I curled my fingers inward, creating a loose fist to keep the heavy object from slipping off. The physical weight of the ring anchored me to the present moment, dragging me out of the freezing, panicked labyrinth of the Boston streets and cementing me firmly inside his gilded cage. Father Thomas closed his eyes, raising a trembling hand in the air. "By the power vested in me, and under the eyes of God, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The words hung in the heavy, incense-laden air, final and absolute. The sound of the velvet-lined ledger snapping shut echoed through the vast, empty space above us like a gavel striking a judge's block. The transaction was complete. The contract was sealed in holy water and syndicate blood. Dante did not lean in to kiss me. There was no theatrical display of false affection for the benefit of the armed men watching from the shadows. Such a gesture would have been a violation of the silent boundary he had established the moment he placed his jacket over my shoulders. Instead, he simply kept his hand wrapped warmly around mine, his thumb resting gently against the heavy gold of the emerald signet ring. I stared down at our joined hands, the contrast stark and undeniable. My pale, trembling fingers marked by the violent, chaotic abuse of my past, securely encased within the steady, powerful grip of the most dangerous man in the city. Outside the thick, historic stone walls of the cathedral, the autumn storm continued to rage, the relentless rain washing away the evidence of my desperate flight. Richard was out there, somewhere in the dark, still believing he owned me, still believing he could control my life and balance my spirit to zero. He had no idea that I had just rewritten the ledger entirely. "It's done," Dante stated, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He finally released my hand, though the ghost of his warmth lingered on my freezing skin. He turned to the underboss, who had already begun silently directing the perimeter guards toward the exits. "Marco, bring the car to the private entrance. We are leaving." The massive doors at the back of the cathedral began to open, the synchronized movement of 30 heavily armed men executing their orders with flawless, terrifying precision. The sanctuary, which had been a suffocating pressure cooker just 10 minutes ago, began to rapidly empty out, leaving only the fading scent of myrrh and the quiet, crackling hiss of the altar candles. I pulled the lapels of the bespoke cashmere jacket tighter around my neck, inhaling the deep, grounding scent of cedar and oak barrel liquor. The exhaustion was finally catching up to me, pulling at my muscles, making my eyelids incredibly heavy. But as he placed a gentle, guiding hand against the small of my back, hovering just an inch above the fabric so as not to startle me, a strange, entirely foreign sensation bloomed in my chest. I was no longer running. I was no longer invisible. I was the fake bride of a criminal empire. And for the first time in 6 terrifying, agonizing months, I knew exactly where I was going to sleep tonight, and I knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that the door would be guarded. The heavy, iron-reinforced oak door of the cathedral's private vestry was left open just a fraction of an inch. It was likely a rare oversight by men who were usually flawless in their execution of security protocols. Or perhaps, as my hyper-vigilant, traumatized brain supplied, it was entirely intentional. I had been instructed by Dante to wait in the adjacent stone corridor, while the perimeter was fully secured for our immediate departure. 2 armed guards stood silently at the far end of the hall, their broad backs turned to me, providing a deceptive illusion of privacy. I leaned against the freezing limestone wall, pulling the mafia boss's oversized bespoke cashmere jacket tighter around my shivering frame, desperately trying to regulate the frantic, erratic beating of my heart. The brutal cold from the 19th century ashlar masonry seeped through my damp clothes. My fingers absent-mindedly traced the degraded lime mortar joints, an ingrained professional habit attempting to ground my terrified mind in the familiar rules of historical conservation. A stark, physical reminder that I was still terrifyingly vulnerable in this chaotic new reality. The architecture of the narrow passageway acted as a perfect acoustic funnel. The ribbed vaulting above caught the low, intense voices from the vestry and carried them directly to my ears with pristine, terrifying clarity. I shouldn't have listened. I should have closed my eyes and focused on the simple, mechanical act of breathing. But survival was a deeply ingrained habit I couldn't easily break. When you spend months anticipating violence, you learn to read every shadow and dissect every whisper. "It is too perfect, boss." The voice belonged to Marco Moretti. The underboss spoke in a low, gravelly timbre that vibrated with suppressed urgency and tactical suspicion. The original bride vanishes an hour before the ceremony. The outer perimeter is breached by a civilian with 0 footprint, and she just happens to stumble directly into the sanctuary at the exact moment you require a proxy to complete the transition of power. Statistically, it is an impossibility. I held my breath, pressing my spine harder against the unyielding stone, closing my eyes as the brutal, analytical logic of his words washed over me. From a purely structural standpoint, Marco was absolutely correct. If I were examining this bizarre sequence of events as a load-bearing column in a historic restoration project, I would immediately flag it for critical stress failure. It was too convenient. It was an anomaly that threatened to bring the entire De Luca empire crashing down into the dust. My mind raced, calculating the terrifying possibility that they might decide I was a spy sent by rival families, or worse, an operative working for Richard. My ex-husband manipulated ledgers and people with equal, terrifying ease. To a paranoid criminal syndicate constantly under heavy surveillance, my desperate arrival probably looked like a meticulously executed infiltration. "She is not a threat, Marco." Dante's voice was a stark contrast to his capo's agitated tone. It was terrifyingly calm, devoid of doubt, resonating with the absolute, unquestionable authority of a sovereign leader. She was running for her life. The terror in her eyes was not manufactured for our benefit. Fear can be faked. The underboss countered immediately, the sound of his heavy footsteps pacing across the vestry floor echoing sharply. Espionage relies on playing the victim. We have rival families looking for any weakness, any leverage to exploit the sudden collapse of tonight's alliance. We know nothing about this Clara Sterling. She could be a plant. She could be wearing a wire, allowing her to wear that historic band, bringing her into the inner sanctum of the estate. It is a catastrophic security risk. My left hand instinctively curled into a tight fist, the emerald signet ring digging painfully into the adjacent fingers. He was right. I was a massive liability, a broken, exhausted woman carrying a mountain of dangerous baggage in the form of a corrupt financial auditor who would stop at nothing to drag me back into the dark. I waited for Dante to agree, for the cold, calculating logic of the mafia boss to override the temporary, inexplicable mercy he had shown me at the altar. I braced myself for the heavy vestry door to swing open, for Marco's dead eyes to lock onto me as he delivered the final, fatal consequence of my intrusion. I examined the bruises on her wrist, Dante stated. The pacing inside the room stopped abruptly. The silence in the vestry proved far from vacant. It felt heavy, suffocating, and tasted of stale incense and impending violence. The contusions were fresh, deep, and overlapping. They were the result of prolonged, sustained physical abuse, not a staged injury for a quick infiltration. Furthermore, her physiological response to my proximity, the rapid pulse, the shallow breathing, the sheer, paralyzing shock, cannot be replicated by a trained operative. She is exactly what she appears to be, a casualty of someone else's cruelty. Even if she is innocent, Marco pressed, his tone lowering to a dangerous, insubordinate level that made my blood run cold. She brings outside chaos into our house. Whoever put those marks on her will come looking. We are inviting a war over a stray, then let them come. The 4 words were spoken so quietly, so casually, that it took a full second for their absolute devastating weight to register. It was not a boast. It was a factual statement of immense, overwhelming power. I imagined the tall, imposing figure of my new fake husband standing in the dimly lit vestry, his cold eyes entirely devoid of fear, daring the entire world to challenge his decree. The DeLuca family does not cower from outside chaos, the boss continued, the temperature in the overheard conversation dropping to absolute zero. And we do not discard a shield once it has been forged. The arrangement serves our immediate strategic needs. It projects stability to our enemies and completes the necessary optics for the council. As for her safety, it is no longer a matter for debate. She wears my ring. That makes her my property to protect. You will instruct the men that Clara is to be treated with the exact same respect and deference they show me. Is that understood, Marco? A long, agonizing pause hung in the air, the silence stretching until it felt like a physical wire pulled taut between them. The underboss was a tactical specialist, a man who dealt in certainties, risk mitigation, and bullet trajectories. Accepting me meant accepting a massive, unpredictable variable into their highly calibrated machine. I could almost hear the rapid calculations happening behind his granite-carved features as he weighed his loyalty against his paranoia. Understood, boss, Marco finally replied, his voice flat, yielding entirely to the unshakable hierarchy of their violent world. I will have the security detail at the estate doubled. And I will run a full background diagnostic on her and this ex-husband she mentioned. Do it quickly and discreetly. The sound of movement indicated their private confrontation was concluding. Panic flared hot in my chest. I couldn't be caught eavesdropping, not when my position was already so precarious. I pushed away from the freezing limestone wall, my wet boots squeaking softly against the polished floor as I scrambled back to my original, designated waiting spot near a towering marble pillar. I smoothed the lapels of the oversized cashmere coat, forcing my erratic breathing to slow down, pasting a blank, terrified mask over my features just as the heavy oak door swung fully open. Dante stepped out into the corridor, his immaculate black tuxedo absorbing the dim light, his presence instantly dominating the narrow architectural space. Marco followed a moment later, his face an impenetrable mask of stoic hostility. The underboss did not look at me directly, but I could feel the sheer, oppressive weight of his suspicion, tracking my every micro-movement. The convoy is ready, Dante announced, his eyes sweeping over my trembling form, taking in the way I was clutching his jacket like a desperate shield. He closed the distance between us in 2 long, fluid strides, his large frame blocking out the rest of the hostile world. "We are leaving the city," I didn't argue. I didn't ask where we were going or what would happen if Richard somehow managed to track the heavily armored vehicles. I simply nodded, stepping into the dark protective shadow he cast, and followed the most dangerous man in Boston out into the freezing storm. The drive to Beacon Hill passed in a tense, adrenaline-fueled blur, isolating me completely from the storm outside. The transition from the chaotic, freezing violence of the Boston streets to the immaculate, pristine interior of the DeLuca estate was so jarring it completely disoriented me. We had traveled in a convoy of 3 black, heavily armored SUVs, the mechanical perfection of the vehicles moving through the rain-slicked city with a predatory grace that went entirely unnoticed by the regular civilians. The tinted, bulletproof glass had wrapped me in a pressurized cabin that smelled of expensive leather and gunpowder. But the true sanctuary didn't materialize until the heavy iron gates of Dante's private property closed decisively behind us. The penthouse estate was an architectural marvel, a stunning blend of modern security and classic old-world opulence situated high above the rest of the world. As we stepped out of the private biometric elevator and into the grand foyer, my trained eyes immediately began cataloging the structural details to keep my mind from fracturing. The seamless integration of modern ballistic glass into the historic archways was a masterclass in adaptive reuse. The floors were laid with imported, dark-veined granite, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the soft, ambient lighting, hidden within the deep coffered ceilings. The walls were paneled in rich, dark mahogany, utilizing flawless mortise and tenon joinery that bespoke centuries-old craftsmanship, purposefully masking the heavily reinforced steel framework I knew must lie beneath. It was a fortress designed to look like a palace, a gilded cage built with unyielding precision. "Gemma," Dante called out, his deep voice carrying effortlessly through the massive, quiet space. Almost instantly, a woman appeared from a hallway leading toward the kitchen wing. She was in her late 50s, wearing a simple but elegant dark dress, her silver-streaked hair pulled back into a neat, immaculate bun. She possessed a warm, maternal face that contrasted sharply with the cold, lethal men I had been surrounded by for the past 2 hours. This was Gemma Rossi, the housekeeper. But the way she carried herself, with a quiet dignity and a sharp, highly observant gaze, suggested she was much more than a mere employee. She was the emotional anchor of this dark, violent household. "Mr. DeLuca," Gemma responded, her voice carrying a soft, authentic Italian accent. She stopped a few feet away, her dark eyes quickly scanning Dante for any signs of injury, before her gaze shifted entirely to me. I knew exactly what she saw. A soaking wet, shivering woman wearing her boss's expensive cashmere jacket over ruined clothes, my pale skin stark against the dark fabric, my wrists branded with the ugly, undeniable marks of domestic violence. I braced myself for the judgment, for the silent, condemning questions about why the sovereign leader had brought a broken stray into his immaculate sanctuary. In Richard's world, the elite corporate circles we moved in, any sign of weakness or imperfection was met with swift, brutal ostracization. But Gemma did not sneer. She did not ask questions. Her eyes simply softened, a profound, immediate well of empathy opening up within her gaze that hit me harder than any physical blow. "Welcome home, Clara," Gemma said warmly, bowing her head slightly in a gesture of genuine respect that fully acknowledged my new terrifying position. The absolute acceptance sent a strange, electric shock through my exhausted system. Dante's wife. It was a lie, a tactical fabrication designed to protect me and secure his power. But hearing my new reality spoken aloud in this warm, safe environment made it feel dangerously real. "She needs dry clothes, a hot shower, and something to eat," Dante continued, turning his imposing frame toward me. He didn't reach out to touch me, maintaining that strict, respectful boundary that simultaneously confused and grounded me. "Gemma will show you to the master suite. You are safe here, Clara. No one comes through those doors without my explicit permission." "Thank you," I whispered, the words feeling completely inadequate for the magnitude of what he was giving me. Dante gave a single, curt nod before turning on his heel and walking down a separate corridor, leaving me standing in the grand foyer with the maternal housekeeper. The silence he left behind was not threatening. It was merely the quiet aftermath of a storm passing. "Come with me, my dear," Gemma instructed gently, stepping forward and offering a warm, reassuring smile. "Let us get you out of those freezing clothes before you catch pneumonia." I followed her through the sprawling penthouse, my wet boots sinking into plush, hand-woven Persian rugs that muffled my footsteps entirely. We entered the master suite, a massive, breathtakingly beautiful room decorated in deep charcoals and soft creams, featuring floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass windows that offered a panoramic view of the sparkling, rain-washed Boston skyline. But I didn't care about the view. I cared about the heavy, solid-core mahogany door that Gemma gently clicked shut behind us, locking the rest of the world out. She moved with practiced efficiency, her actions a soothing balm to my frayed, terrified nerves. Within minutes, she had drawn a hot bath in the sprawling marble en-suite, filling the air with the calming scent of lavender and eucalyptus. She didn't hover, recognizing the deep-seated need for privacy that trauma victims often craved. She simply set a stack of soft folded clothes on the granite vanity and stepped out, promising to return with tea. I peeled off the damp, ruined layers of my past life, shivering as the cool ambient air hit my bruised skin. When I finally stepped into the scalding water, the intense heat seeped into my aching muscles, slowly melting the ice that had been crystallizing in my veins since Richard ambushed me in the alley. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the smooth porcelain, listening to the absolute, unbroken silence of the secure penthouse. The contrast was staggering. Only hours ago, I had been fighting for my life in the rain. Now I was bathing in luxury, protected by a private army. When I emerged, dressed in a set of ridiculously soft silk pajamas, and wrapped in a thick plush robe that felt like a gentle hug, I found Gemma waiting in the small, intimate sitting area of the bedroom. She had arranged a silver tray on the low-glass coffee table, featuring a steaming porcelain teapot, a small plate of delicate almond biscotti, and a small medical kit. "Sit, Clara," she murmured, patting the edge of the velvet sofa. I hesitated for a heartbeat before complying, my bare feet sinking into the thick carpet. I was exhausted, bone-weary and running on the last fumes of adrenaline, but I couldn't stop my analytical mind from assessing her every move. Gemma poured a cup of fragrant chamomile tea, the steam rising in delicate ribbons. She handed it to me, ensuring my trembling fingers had a secure grip on the delicate porcelain before letting go. The warmth radiated through the ceramic, grounding me. "Drink," she urged softly. "It will calm your nerves. The shock is a terrible thing for the body to carry." I took a small sip, the hot, soothing liquid sliding down my raw throat. It tasted like safety. Cover-up makeup had become my specialty over the past 6 months. Foundation 3 shades darker than my natural skin, layered thick over the purple fingerprints circling my wrists to maintain a facade of normalcy. But tonight, sitting in this immaculate master suite, I didn't have to hide the damage. Gemma reached for the medical kit, opening it to reveal clean bandages and several soft compresses soaking in a chilled chamomile solution. But before she could retrieve them, the heavy mahogany door clicked open. Dante DeLuca stepped into the intimate sitting area. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket and tie, wearing only a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the dark, intricate ink of syndicate tattoos, tracing the heavy musculature of his skin. The sheer physical presence of him instantly altered the air pressure in the room, commanding absolute attention. Gemma immediately stood up, bowing her head slightly. She required no verbal instruction. With a quiet, deeply respectful nod to both of us, the housekeeper excused herself, slipping out the door and closing it softly behind her. Dante crossed the room in 3 long, silent strides. Instead of taking the armchair opposite the table, he sat down directly on the velvet sofa next to me. The proximity was overwhelming, radiating a terrifying heat that made my breath catch in my throat. I instinctively pulled my bruised wrists closer to my chest, a defensive maneuver ingrained into my muscle memory by Richard's cruelty. Dante did not force my hands apart. He simply reached out, his massive scarred hands hovering just inches from my own. "May I?" he asked, his deep voice incredibly gentle, requesting permission before encroaching on my physical space. In my marriage to the auditor, my body had never been my own. It was a canvas for his frustration, a ledger where he tallied his anger. The concept of a man with this much raw, lethal power asking for consent to touch my injuries was so profoundly alien it made my throat tight. I gave a small, jerky nod, placing my teacup on the table, and slowly extending my trembling hands toward him. Dante's fingers were calloused, roughened by a lifetime of violence, but his touch was feather-light as he took my wrists. He retrieved one of the cold chamomile compresses from the medical kit, applying it to the deep overlapping contusions with an almost agonizingly slow, meticulous care. The icy relief was instantaneous, seeping into the inflamed tissue, but it was nothing compared to the shock of his gentleness. "The men in my world can be hard," Dante said quietly, his keen sight entirely focused on his task, watching the way my pulse fluttered wildly against his thumb. "I am a man of absolute authority. I carry the weight of a very dark empire on my shoulders, but I do not tolerate cruelty to the innocent." He held the cold compress in place, his thumb drawing a slow hypnotic circle over my unbruised skin to anchor me in the present moment. "You do not need to be afraid of me, Clara," he continued, the rumbling cadence of his voice vibrating in the quiet space between us. "I brought you here to heal, not to hurt." I stared at the pristine white gauze waiting on the table, the scent of the herbal compress mixing with his expensive cologne, and the hot chamomile tea. The extreme safety fantasy I had secretly harbored during my darkest, most terrifying nights was unfolding around me in real time. The financial manipulation, the physical terror, the constant, suffocating fear of surveillance. It had all been severed the moment Dante slid the emerald signet ring onto my hand. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, echoing the doubt that still lingered in my rational mind. "I am just a stranger. I bring nothing but trouble to your door." Dante finished securing the cold compress with a soft bandage, ensuring it wouldn't restrict my movement. He didn't release my hand immediately. Instead, his gaze lifted, locking onto mine with an intensity that stripped away every defense I had left. "Sometimes, Clara, the strongest fortresses are built, not to keep the world out," he murmured, his thumb brushing lightly over the antique gold band, and raw emerald now resting on my left hand, "but to protect the one thing inside that actually matters." He slowly released my hands, rising gracefully from the sofa. He turned off the main overhead lights, leaving only the soft, warm glow of a bedside lamp. "Get some sleep," Dante instructed softly, his silhouette massive in the dim lighting. "You are not invisible anymore, and you are not alone." He quietly exited the room, the heavy solid core door shutting firmly in his wake. I was left alone, in the beautiful, secure sanctuary, holding my wrists, the heavy gold ring on my finger catching the dim light. Tomorrow would bring a tidal wave of complications, questions, and the terrifying reality of navigating a criminal syndicate. But tonight, surrounded by immaculate granite and profound silence, I finally allowed myself to close my eyes and simply breathe. Sunlight filtered through curtains the color of champagne, soft and golden and completely unfamiliar. My eyes opened slowly, the heavy fog of sheer exhaustion lifting, piece by piece, until the stark reality of my new existence rushed back in a breathless wave. I lay perfectly still, my pulse automatically accelerating, as I waited for the familiar, terrifying sound of heavy footsteps outside the bedroom door. I braced myself for the metallic scrape of a key in the lock, the smell of stale alcohol, and the sharp, manicured cruelty of the corrupt financial auditor I had once called a husband. But the silence in the DeLuca master suite was absolute, fortified by thick granite walls and an army of lethal men. I raised my left arm, the emerald signet ring on my left hand, catching the morning light, sending a brilliant, raw green flash across the ceiling that grounded me instantly. It was real. The fake wedding, the terrifying escape into the Gothic cathedral, the sovereign protector who had wrapped me in his cashmere coat, the lingering scent of cold chamomile from the compresses Dante had personally applied to my bruised wrists the night before. It had all actually happened. I pushed back the heavy silk duvet, my bare feet touching the plush, hand-woven antique carpet. The ambient temperature of the room was perfectly regulated, a sharp, luxurious contrast to the freezing, drafty apartment I had been hiding in for the past 6 months. On a velvet chaise lounge near the expansive wardrobe, Gemma had left a set of folded clothes. I moved toward them with a lingering sense of disbelief, my architectural conservator mind automatically appreciating the fine, durable weave of the fabrics. The garments were meticulously chosen, a soft, dove-gray cashmere turtleneck that offered both incredible warmth and discreet concealment for the lingering marks on my collarbone, paired with impeccably tailored charcoal wool trousers. I dressed methodically, finding deep comfort in the familiar mechanical motions. The clothes acted as a soft, impenetrable armor, completely different from the restrictive, perfectly pressed dresses Richard had forced me to wear to his corporate galas to project the illusion of a flawless marriage. Those dresses were designed to make me a decorative object, easily controlled and quickly dismissed. This cashmere felt like an acknowledgement of my humanity. A soft, polite knock at the heavy mahogany door broke the profound silence. "Clara?" Gemma's warm maternal voice drifted through the thick wood. Mr. DeLuca has requested your presence in his private study whenever you are ready. I'll be right out, I managed to say, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. I took a deep breath, smoothing the soft cashmere over my ribs, where a dull, persistent ache still throbbed from my ex-husband's brutal ambush in the alleyway. I stepped out into the grand hallway, where Gemma offered a reassuring, deeply empathetic smile before leading me through the labyrinthine layout of the penthouse. As we walked, I couldn't help but analyze the structural integrity of the environment to keep my rising panic at bay. The vaulted ceilings, the seamless integration of modern ballistic security cameras into the classic crown molding, the reinforced steel doors painted flawlessly to mimic antique wood. It was a masterpiece of defensive architecture. It was explicitly designed to withstand a brutal siege while maintaining the illusion of refined, absolute tranquility. I noted the load-bearing supports, disguised brilliantly behind decorative pilasters, realizing that the entire estate was essentially a high-altitude fortress. Gemma stopped in front of a set of massive double oak doors. She gave me an encouraging nod before quietly retreating down the corridor, her footsteps making absolutely no sound. I was left alone, staring at the polished brass handles. I had perfected the art of being invisible over the past year, hiding in crowds and constantly looking over my shoulder. But walking into that room meant stepping entirely out of the shadows. I reached out, my trembling fingers wrapping around the cool metal, and pushed the heavy door open. The study was an overwhelming space, a sanctuary of high intellect and calculated violent power. 3 walls were lined with floor-to-soiling bookshelves, constructed from dark oiled walnut, filled with centuries-old leather-bound volumes, historic syndicate ledgers, and sprawling architectural folios. The 4th wall was comprised entirely of thick bulletproof glass, offering a breathtaking, dizzying panoramic view of the Boston skyline beneath a clear, crisp autumn sky. The scent of old paper, expensive cedar, and fine Scotch permeated the air, wrapping around me like a familiar protective layer. And standing by the massive window, silhouetted sharply against the bright morning light, was the sovereign protector himself. Dante DeLuca turned slowly as I entered. He had traded his formal wedding tuxedo for a sharply tailored navy suit, lacking a tie, the top 2 buttons of his crisp white dress shirt casually undone. The slight relaxation of his attire did absolutely nothing to diminish the terrifying, lethal aura that surrounded his massive frame. He looked like an apex predator momentarily resting in his den, fully aware of every microscopic shift in air pressure within his territory. His dark look locked onto me, taking in my appearance, scanning the high collar of the cashmere sweater and the steady, albeit incredibly cautious, way I held my posture. "Did you sleep?" he asked, his deep, resonant baritone cutting effortlessly through the vast silence of the study. It wasn't a polite morning pleasantry. It was a tactical assessment of my physical and mental endurance. "Yes," I answered truthfully, stepping further into the intimidating room. For the first time in months, I didn't wake up in a panic. "Good." He gestured toward a pair of heavy, tufted leather armchairs situated across from a massive mahogany desk. "Sit, Clara. We have a considerable amount of ground to cover, and I prefer absolute clarity in my operations." I moved toward the chair, the thick, premium leather, sighing softly as I sank into it. The chair was incredibly comfortable but slightly oversized, subtly reinforcing the overwhelming power dynamic of the room. Dante did not sit behind his impressive desk, a psychological maneuver I immediately recognized from my days dealing with elite corporate clients. Instead, he moved to the matching armchair opposite mine, leaning forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his large, scarred hands clasped loosely together. The physical proximity was intense, eliminating the barrier of the desk and forcing me to confront the sheer, magnetic magnitude of his presence. "Last night, I offered you a crown to save your life," Dante began, his tone grave and entirely devoid of emotional inflection. "But you must understand the architecture of the danger you have just married into. My world does not operate on charity or sudden mercy, Clara. It operates on leverage, absolute loyalty, and the projection of unbreakable strength." The woman who was supposed to be standing beside me at the altar was the daughter of a powerful, volatile allied family from New York. That marriage was a highly negotiated treaty, designed to bridge a critical gap in our supply chains, and, more importantly, to demonstrate a unified front to the Commission. I listened intently, my professional mind automatically categorizing the dark information. It was exactly like reinforcing a crumbling load-bearing wall in a historic preservation project. When a primary support beam fails, you must immediately implement a secondary brace to prevent catastrophic structural collapse. I was the secondary brace. When she fled, Dante continued, a muscle near his sharp jaw twitching fractionally at the memory of the syndicate embarrassment. She didn't just break a vow. She created a perceived weakness in the DeLuca Empire. In my syndicate, perceived weakness is an open invitation for war. If I had walked out of that cathedral alone, without a bride to solidify the transition of power, the rival families would have seen a fractured alliance. They would have moved against my territories before midnight. So you used me to plug the hole in the dam, I stated quietly. The terrifying reality of my new role snapping into perfect, crystalline focus. Dante's eyes narrowed slightly, a glimmer of genuine, unexpected respect flashing in those storm-gray depths. He recognized the analytical sharpness in my response. Yes, your sudden appearance was chaotic, but it provided a necessary, immediate solution. By sliding that heirloom onto your hand, I effectively communicated to my enemies that the DeLuca family is never caught unprepared. I presented you to the room as a deliberate choice, a closely guarded secret, rather than a desperate contingency plan. I looked down at the heavy gold band on my left hand, the raw emerald seeming to glow with an internal, dangerous fire. But your underboss, Marco. He knows the truth. He knows I am just a terrified civilian who stumbled through the wrong door. Marco knows, Dante acknowledged, his voice shifting into a lethal, gravelly depth that sent an involuntary shiver straight down my spine. But Marco is a soldier. He obeys the hierarchy. To the rest of the city, to the families who actively wish to see me bleed, you are my chosen wife. You are the untouchable queen of this syndicate. He leaned back, his broad shoulders settling against the dark leather. This means you must play the role flawlessly, Clara. You must project an aura of absolute belonging and unwavering confidence. If anyone suspects that our marriage is a hollow transaction, if they sense your residual fear and realize you are merely hiding from a corrupt financial auditor, they will use you as leverage against me. They will target you simply to test my defenses. The sheer, crushing gravity of his words settled heavily onto my chest. I had traded the localized, claustrophobic terror of Richard's domestic abuse for the sprawling, lethal politics of the criminal underworld. Yet, strangely, I didn't feel the paralyzing panic I had expected to consume me. Richard had manipulated me through relentless gaslighting and covert cruelty, constantly shifting the rules of my reality, so I never knew where I stood. Dante DeLuca was doing the exact opposite. He was laying out the blueprint of my danger with brutal, refreshing honesty. He was showing me the structural flaws of his empire and handing me the hard hat. I am a historical architectural conservator, I said, lifting my chin, refusing to let my gaze waver from his intense, penetrating stare. I know how to study a structure, understand its complex rules, and blend seamlessly into its environment without disturbing the foundation. If you need me to play the part of a sovereign protector's wife, I will do it. I will not show them fear. Dante stared at me for a long, silent moment. The tension in the quiet study grew incredibly thick, pulling taut between us like a physical wire. He was searching my face, reading the map of my exhaustion, brutally testing the structural integrity of my resolve. Slowly, a dark, devastatingly attractive smirk touched the corner of his mouth, softening the harsh granite of his features. I believe you, he murmured, the sound vibrating with an unexpected, deeply intimate warmth. The transition from the strategic briefing to the cold, hard reality of the transaction happened moments later. Dante stood up, moving behind his massive mahogany desk with a predatory grace. He opened a locked, biometrically secured drawer and retrieved a heavy, cream-colored dossier, placing it carefully on the pristine, leather-bound surface of the desk. This brings us to the formal parameters of our arrangement, he announced, the fleeting warmth vanishing completely, replaced instantly by the stoic sovereign. Come here. I stood up, crossing the expanse of the luxurious vintage rug, my heart beating a slightly faster, erratic rhythm against my ribs. I approached the desks, staring at the thick stack of premium, watermarked paper. In my previous life, documents exactly like these were the instruments of my destruction. Richard had used legal contracts, complex financial ledgers, and convoluted offshore accounts to trap me, burying my financial independence under mountains of impenetrable corporate jargon. He had audited my life until I was nothing but a zero on his spreadsheet. I had learned to deeply fear the power of a signature. Dante opened the folder, rotating it precisely so the text faced me. He placed a heavy gold-plated fountain pen beside it. "This is a legally binding contract," he explained, his voice steady, low, and perfectly clinical. "It was drafted in the early hours of the morning by my personal legal team. It outlines the precise boundaries, expectations, and absolute protections of our fake marriage." I looked down at the crisp black ink, the dense paragraphs of legal terminology fading slightly out of focus before my eyes. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, as I traced the sharp edge of the paper. "Read it carefully," Dante commanded softly, stepping back just a fraction to give me space, his deep gaze watching my every physiological reaction. "I do not deal in deception with those who live under my roof." I focused heavily on the document, forcing my analytical mind to engage past the trauma. I bypassed the standard non-disclosure provisions and the complex financial indemnities, my eyes landing directly on the core stipulations. It was incredibly thorough. Section 3 detailed my required public appearances, attending syndicate galas, charity dinners, and private meetings where my presence was structurally necessary to project stability. Section 4 explicitly prohibited me from attempting to contact my former associates or leaving the estate without a fully armed security detail. It was a gilded cage, meticulously defined in black and white. But it was Provision 7 that made my breath hitch painfully in my throat. The primary signatory, Dante De Luca, assumes absolute, unconditional responsibility for the physical safety, medical care, and psychological well-being of the secondary signatory, Clara Sterling. Any external threat, specifically including but not limited to Richard Thorne, will be met with maximum definitive retaliation by the De Luca Syndicate. I stared at the name, Richard Thorne, seeing my abuser's name reduced to a mere liability on a piece of paper, a designated target legally bound to be destroyed if he ever came near me, sent a profound, staggering wave of relief crashing through my exhausted system. Richard had always believed he was entirely untouchable, shielded by his immense corporate wealth and his pristine public reputation. But this contract was a concrete promise of poetic justice. It was a formal declaration that there was a predator in this city, much larger and infinitely more dangerous than he was, and that predator was currently standing 3 feet away from me. I looked up from the document, my eyes meeting Dante's. He was watching me with an unnerving, hyper-focused intensity, his broad chest rising and falling in a slow, perfectly controlled rhythm. He told me that if I ever tried to leave, he would ensure I never worked in architecture again, I whispered, the painful, humiliating admission slipping out before I could stop it. He said he would freeze my accounts, destroy my professional reputation, and find me wherever I tried to hide. He told me the law couldn't protect me from a man who writes the ledgers. Dante's jaw tightened, a terrifying, cold fury hardening his aristocratic features. The civilized veneer of the bespoke suit seemed to momentarily slip, revealing the ruthless, violent mafia boss underneath. "Richard Thorne is a parasite who plays games with paper," Dante growled, speaking with a rough, gravelly rasp that shook the air in the room. "I do not play games, Clara. I dismantle empires. The moment you sign that document, his threats become meaningless noise. If he takes a single step toward you, if he so much as breathes your name in a crowded room, I will break him so completely that even his own shadow will forget him." The absolute certainty in his vow hung in the heavy, silent air of the study. It wasn't an empty boast or a romantic exaggeration. It was a factual statement of impending violence, wielded exclusively for my protection. I looked back down at the contract. It was a terrifying leap into the dark, a formal, binding alliance with the criminal underworld. But as I mentally calculated the brutal reality of my existence, comparing the insidious, gaslighting abuse of my past with the cold, absolute honesty of the man standing before me, the choice became crystalline. I picked up the heavy gold fountain pen. The metal was cool and solid against my skin. I didn't hesitate. I pressed the fine nib against the thick, cream-colored paper and signed my name on the dotted line. Clara Sterling. The dark ink flowed smoothly, a permanent binding that severed me from my past and anchored me securely to the sovereign protector. I placed the pen down. The soft click echoed loudly in the quiet room. Dante reached forward, his large, calloused hand covering the document, his fingers brushing briefly against mine. The contact was fleeting, but it sent an intense, electric shock straight up my arm, a physical manifestation of the unspoken tension that hummed constantly between us. He closed the dossier with a definitive snap, locking the marriage contract away in his desk drawer. "It is done," he said quietly, looking down at me with a gaze that felt incredibly heavy, possessive, and entirely consuming. You belong to the DeLuca family now. I stood up, the lingering exhaustion of the past 24 hours threatening to pull me under. But a new, quiet strength had begun to build in my core. I had surrendered my freedom, yes. I had agreed to live under the constant surveillance of armed guards, to navigate the treacherous, violent politics of a mafia syndicate, and to share a life with a man who commanded killers. But as I looked around the immaculate, soundproofed study, absorbing the aroma of aged spirits and the unyielding solidity of the mahogany walls, a profound realization settled into my bones. The outside world was full of men who wore masks of civility while hiding monsters inside. Dante DeLuca wore his monster on the outside, a terrifying, impenetrable shield that he had just formally dedicated to keeping me safe. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice steady, the emerald signet ring acting as a permanent shield, catching the bright Boston sunlight pouring through the bulletproof glass. Dante didn't smile, but the harsh, unforgiving lines around his eyes softened just a fraction. He stepped around the desk, closing the distance between us until I was once again engulfed in his overwhelming heat and the intoxicating scent of his cologne. "Tomorrow the real work begins," he murmured, his voice a low rumble meant only for my ears. "The council will want to meet the woman who replaced their carefully constructed alliance. You will need to be flawless, Clara. But for the rest of today, you are off limits to the world. Gemma will bring you lunch. Rest, recover." He turned and walked toward the massive double doors, his posture rigid and commanding. He paused with his hand on the brass handle, looking back over his shoulder, his metallic stare pinning me in place. "You are not a stray, Clara," he stated, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "You are my wife, and no one will ever make you feel invisible again." He exited the study, the heavy oak doors closing firmly behind him, leaving me alone in the quiet, sunlit room. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the sprawling, chaotic city far below. Somewhere down there, Richard was still frantically searching, his arrogance blinding him to the truth. I pressed my palm against the cold, bulletproof glass, a small, victorious smile finally touching my lips. The game had fundamentally changed. I was no longer the prey. I was the partner of the apex predator, and the true battle was just getting started. The heavy, oppressive overcast of the following afternoon promised another bitter, freezing coastal storm, casting long, slate-gray shadows across the pristine expanse of the master suite. I had spent the last 36 hours existing in a state of suspended animation, moving quietly between the sprawling, sunlit bedroom and the massive marble ensuite, allowing the profound silence of the heavily fortified estate to slowly knit my frayed nerves back together. The dull, persistent ache in my ribs had faded to a manageable throb, and the violent, overlapping purple contusions circling my left wrist had begun their slow, biological transition into a sickly, jaundiced yellow. I traced the edge of the bruising with a trembling fingertip, my analytical mind cataloging the healing process, the same way I would assess the stabilization of a fractured limestone cornice. The damage was still glaringly visible, a permanent map of the trauma Richard had inflicted, but the structural collapse had been halted. I was reinforcing the foundation. The quiet click of the mahogany door opening broke the stillness, signaling the end of my temporary, restorative isolation. Gemma entered the room with her characteristic, practiced grace, her silver-streaked hair pulled back into that immaculate, unyielding bun. She was not alone. Two silent, incredibly discreet female attendants followed her, carefully maneuvering a rolling, polished brass garment rack that held several opaque, heavy canvas bags. The housekeeper dismissed the attendants with a single, authoritative nod, waiting until the heavy door clicked shut, before turning her warm, highly observant gaze toward me. The transition from the quiet sanctuary of recovery to the brutal, high-stakes reality of the syndicate's expectations was beginning. "The council dinner is scheduled for 8 o'clock, Clara," Gemma announced softly, her authentic Italian accent wrapping around the harsh syllables of the criminal terminology like velvet over steel. "Mr. DeLuca has requested that we begin your preparations. The men you will meet tonight deal exclusively in leverage, weakness, and absolute power. They will look for any microscopic fracture in your armor to exploit against him." I stood up from the velvet chaise lounge, the soft cashmere of my borrowed sweater brushing against my healing skin, my pulse giving a familiar, erratic flutter of anxiety. In my past life, formal dinners were psychological battlegrounds, where Richard used my appearance as a weapon, forcing me into restrictive, overly revealing garments designed to showcase his wealth while keeping me physically uncomfortable and deeply insecure. He would dictate the exact shade of my lipstick, the height of my heels, and the precise mechanical smile I was required to maintain, while he audited the lives of the men across the table. I approached the brass garment rack with a heavy, deeply ingrained sense of dread, expecting a similar transactional humiliation. Instead, Gemma reached for the zipper of the central canvas bag, pulling it down with a smooth, decisive hiss to reveal a masterpiece of sartorial architecture. It was a gown of deep, rich burgundy silk, a color that immediately evoked the visual weight of aged wine and old, dangerous money. As a historical architectural conservator, my eyes automatically bypassed the surface aesthetic to analyze the complex, underlying structure of the garment. The bodice was a marvel of hidden, supportive corsetry, utilizing flexible, reinforced boning that promised to hold my posture perfectly rigid without restricting my diaphragm. The fabric did not merely drape. It was engineered to flow and pool, with a deliberate, liquid heaviness that required absolute confidence to wear. It was not a dress designed for a submissive, decorative object meant to stand quietly in the shadows. It was a suit of armor forged for a sovereign queen. "It is beautiful," I whispered, reaching out to brush my fingertips against the cool, flawless silk, the material sending a stark tactile contrast against the rough, calloused edges of my healing skin. "It was selected specifically for you by Mr. DeLuca," Gemma noted quietly, her dark eyes tracking the micro-expressions crossing my face as I processed the information. "He instructed the atelier to prioritize structural elegance and absolute physical comfort. He explicitly forbade anything that might agitate the injuries on your ribs, or require you to expose the skin you are not yet ready to share." The sheer, staggering level of thoughtful, meticulous consideration from a man who commanded lethal violence sent a profound, aching shock straight through my chest. He had remembered the subtle flinch of my breath when I moved. He had calculated the precise physical boundaries of my trauma, without ever forcing me to articulate them aloud. I stared at the burgundy silk, my vision blurring slightly as the dramatic irony of my situation washed over me. I had fled a legitimate, socially respected professional who monitored my every calorie and bruised my bones, only to find absolute, uncompromising respect and tender accommodation from the most dangerous mafia boss in Boston. Gemma gestured toward the plush velvet dressing screen set up near the expansive vanity, offering me the privacy I so desperately needed. I retreated behind the heavy fabric, stripping off the comfortable dove-gray cashmere, and stepping carefully into the elaborate structure of the gown. The silk slid over my skin like cold water, the hidden corsetry engaging with a firm, supportive embrace that instantly corrected the defensive, hunched posture I had adopted over the past 6 months. I didn't feel restricted. I felt anchored. When I emerged, stepping back into the warm, ambient light of the master suite, the housekeeper was already waiting with a small, pristine makeup kit and a velvet jewelry box. She directed me to sit at the granite vanity, standing behind me to meet my gaze in the wide, spotless mirror. For the next 30 minutes, the room was filled with the quiet, domestic sounds of transformation. The soft rustle of silk, the delicate clink of glass bottles, the rhythmic, soothing sweep of makeup brushes. I watched my own reflection change, the terrified, exhausted fugitive fading away beneath a layer of flawless, carefully applied foundation. Gemma worked with a gentle, exacting precision, applying concealer to the fading yellow edges of the bruises on my neck and collarbone. Not to hide them in shame, but to deny the rival syndicate bosses the satisfaction of seeing my vulnerability. "You are trembling, child," the housekeeper observed softly, her experienced hands pausing as she applied a dark, crimson tint to my lips that perfectly matched the heavy burgundy silk. "I have never been in a room with men like this," I admitted, my voice a fragile, fractured whisper that betrayed the carefully constructed armor I was wearing. Richard was a monster in private, but he operated within the boundaries of corporate law. These men tonight, they exist entirely outside of it. What if I say the wrong thing? What if they see straight through the contract and realize I am just a terrified liability dragging Dante down? Gemma set the lipstick down on the granite counter, the small, sharp sound cutting through my rising panic. She placed her warm, capable hands firmly on my bare, shivering shoulders, leaning down until her face was level with mine in the mirror. "Listen to me very carefully, Clara," she commanded, her maternal tone shifting seamlessly into a gravelly, absolute seriousness that echoed the very nature of the empire she served. Dante De Luca does not make mistakes, and he does not take on liabilities. His father was a man of sheer, unadulterated brutality, a man who ruled this city through blind terror and left a trail of broken things in his wake. When Dante took the throne, he rebuilt this syndicate on a foundation of absolute, unyielding control. He is a fortress, and a fortress is defined not by the violence it projects outward, but by the complete, impenetrable safety it provides to those standing inside its walls. I stared at the reflection of the older woman, my chest rising and falling against the rigid, supportive structure of the silk bodice. He chose to place that emerald signet ring on your finger, Gemma continued, her thumb brushing lightly over the fabric covering my collarbone. He did not do it out of pity. He did it because he recognized a survivor. When you walk into that dining hall tonight, you do not need to match their violence. You only need to remember who is standing beside you. He will not let them touch you. He will not let them question you. You are under his protection, and in this city, that is the closest thing to the hand of God. She reached for the velvet jewelry box, clicking the tiny gold clasp open to reveal a stunning, vintage diamond choker that caught the ambient light and fractured it into 1,000 brilliant shards. It was a heavy, substantial piece designed to draw the eye and project immense, undeniable wealth. But as she fastened the cool platinum clasp around the back of my neck, the weight of it felt distinctly different from the restrictive, suffocating chains of my past. It felt like a boundary line drawn in diamonds. "Thank you, Gemma," I murmured, my erratic pulse finally beginning to settle into a slow, measured rhythm. "You are ready," she stated, stepping back to allow me to take in the final result. The woman staring back at me in the mirror was a stranger. The heavy burgundy silk pooled elegantly around my feet, the structural corsetry enforcing a posture of absolute, unshakable royalty. The vintage diamonds sparkled fiercely against my pale skin, completely masking the trauma hidden beneath the flawless makeup. The heavy gold of the emerald signet ring on my left hand anchored the entire illusion, projecting a terrifying, undeniable claim of ownership and protection. I was no longer the bleeding, exhausted prey sprinting through the freezing rain. I was the sovereign's chosen partner, a masterpiece of defensive architecture ready to face the wolves. I stood up, the liquid heaviness of the silk sweeping across the plush carpet, and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. It was time to test the foundation. The exclusive syndicate dinner was hosted in a private, subterranean dining hall located deep beneath the historic financial district, a location that required multiple biometric checkpoints and layered security protocols to access. The transition from the heavily armored SUV to the opulent, windowless chamber was a masterclass in extreme, atmospheric contrast. The air inside the massive room was thick, heavy, and suffocating, carrying the distinct, metallic taste of impending ruin, mixed with the cloying scents of expensive cigars and heavy musky colognes. The architectural layout of the space was deeply intentional, designed to amplify paranoia and enforce hierarchy. The vaulted ceilings were lined with sound-dampening acoustic panels, while the walls were clad in dark, unpolished granite that seemed to absorb the dim, flickering light from the massive iron chandeliers hanging above the central, elongated dining table. Dante walked beside me, his massive frame encased in a flawless, bespoke charcoal suit that radiated a dark, lethal authority. He did not offer his arm as a polite, gentlemanly gesture. He kept his left hand resting securely, heavily at the small of my back, hovering just a fraction of an inch above the burgundy silk. The physical proximity was overwhelming, his intense body heat bleeding through the fabric, acting as a constant, tactile reminder of the absolute protection he had promised. Every time my anxiety threatened to spike, every time the suffocating atmosphere of the room pressed down on my healing ribs, the subtle, immovable pressure of his hand grounded me instantly. As we crossed the threshold into the main dining area, the low, murmuring conversations of the assembled crime bosses ceased abruptly. The silence that fell over the room carried a tangible weight. It formed a pressurized, lethal vacuum, filled with the sharp, calculating stares of 12 ruthless men who controlled the lifeblood of the city's underworld. They were seated around the massive, highly polished mahogany table, flanked by their respective underbosses and silent, armed guards standing in the deep shadows of the perimeter. These were men who ordered executions between courses, men who viewed human lives as expendable commodities on their illicit ledgers. I stared at the wine spreading across the white tablecloth, like blood seeping through gauze. It was a phantom memory. Recalling a dinner from a year ago where Richard had deliberately knocked over his glass just to watch me scramble, humiliated, to clean it up in front of his wealthy clients. The phantom sensation of that intense, paralyzing shame threatened to surface, a conditioned response to a room full of powerful, watching men. My breath hitched, the hidden corsetry of the gown pressing tightly against my ribs. Dante instantly felt the microscopic shift in my physical state. He did not look down at me, nor did he break his sweeping, predatory assessment of the room, but his hand at the small of my back flattened, pressing fully warmly against my spine. The message was explicitly clear, transmitted entirely through the electric shock of his touch. I am here. You are safe. Do not yield. I forced my chin up, drawing a slow, measured breath, allowing the heavy, unyielding structure of the burgundy silk to dictate my posture. I matched his slow, deliberate pace, walking toward the head of the table with an expression I carefully molded into an unreadable stoic mask. "Gentlemen," Dante announced, his deep, resonant baritone cutting through the heavy silence like a physical blade. He did not raise his voice, yet the sheer, sovereign authority in his tone commanded absolute, immediate attention. "I trust the transition of the port authorities has proceeded without the bureaucratic delays we previously discussed." He pulled out the heavy, high-backed leather chair to his immediate right, a position of supreme honor and vulnerability. He waited, his fierce gaze challenging anyone in the room to object, until I had smoothly taken my seat. The silk rustled softly against the polished wood. Only then did he sit at the absolute head of the table, his presence instantly dominating the complex, volatile dynamics of the gathering. "The ports are secure, Dante," answered a heavy-set man, seated halfway down the table, his voice laced with a thick, grating Boston accent and a thin layer of barely concealed insolence. This was the rival boss, whose territory aggressively bordered the DeLuca Syndicate's southern shipping lanes. His small, cruel eyes darted away from Dante, landing directly on me, stripping away the vintage diamonds and the expensive silk to assess the perceived weakness underneath. Though we were all deeply surprised by the sudden shift in your domestic arrangements. The previous alliance was supposed to guarantee the northern routes. Yet, you arrive with a stranger. A very beautiful stranger, admittedly, but one without a recognized name. The insult was deliberate, a calculated probe designed to test the structural integrity of Dante's unexpected marriage. The air pressure in the subterranean room plummeted to absolute zero. The armed guards standing in the shadows shifted slightly, the faint, terrifying rustle of concealed weapons echoing off the granite walls. My heart hammered violently against my bruised ribs, the primal urge to shrink away, to apologize for my existence, screaming in my ears. In Richard's world, when a superior challenged my presence, I was expected to lower my eyes and remain completely invisible. Before I could even process the terrifying implication of the rival boss's words, Dante reached across the short distance between our chairs. He did not speak immediately. He calmly, deliberately picked up my left hand from the pristine white tablecloth, his large, calloused fingers wrapping securely around my trembling ones. He lifted my hand just enough for the magnificent green stone to catch the flickering light of the iron chandelier, casting a brutal, undeniable green reflection directly across the dissenter's face. "Clara is my wife," Dante stated. The words were not defensive. They were a sovereign decree, spoken with a quiet, lethally calm cadence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "She carries the DeLuca name. She wears my family's shield. Her presence at this table is not a subject for debate, speculation, or your uninvited commentary. If you find yourself confused by my decisions, you are welcome to step outside with Marco and discuss the sudden termination of your southern shipping privileges." The threat was absolute, catastrophic, and delivered without a single change in his stoic expression. Dante was casually threatening to dismantle a multi-million-dollar illicit operation and initiate a full-scale syndicate war, simply because a man had questioned my legitimacy. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his protectiveness sent a profound, aching shock straight to my core. He was not using me as a passive shield. He was wielding his entire, terrifying empire as a weapon to defend my honor. The rival boss's face drained of color, his cruel eyes wide with sudden, acute realization. He had tested the perimeter and encountered a heavily armed fortress. He swallowed hard, the bravado evaporating instantly in the face of Dante's unyielding granite facade. No disrespect intended, boss, the man mumbled quickly, lowering his gaze to his empty plate, his heavy hands retreating to his lap. The northern routes are secure. The transition is respected. Dante stared at the humbled rival for 3 long, agonizing seconds, letting the oppressive silence crush the remaining defiance out of the room. He did not gloat. He simply lowered our joined hands back to the table, maintaining his warm, secure grip on my fingers. Excellent, Dante murmured, signaling for the first course to be served with a subtle flick of his wrist. The tension in the room slowly began to bleed out, replaced by the clinking of heavy crystal glasses and the low, careful murmurs of tactical business discussions. I sat perfectly still, my hand securely encased in his, the tactile sensation of his calloused skin, grounding me in the surreal, violent reality of the dinner. As an architectural conservator, I spent my life looking for the keystone. The single, wedge-shaped piece of masonry at the apex of an arch that locks all the other stones into position, bearing the immense weight of the structure and preventing total collapse. I looked around the massive, dark granite room, observing the lethal, paranoid men who constantly plotted each other's ruin, the hidden weapons, the fragile alliances built on blood and money, and then I looked at the man sitting beside me. Dante was the keystone. He bore the crushing, violent weight of this entire dark world with effortless, terrifying grace, holding the chaotic, murderous elements in perfect, absolute balance through sheer force of will. And beneath the heavy oak table, hidden from the calculating eyes of the criminal elite, his thumb was gently, rhythmically stroking the side of my hand, a silent, continuous transmission of profound safety. The anxiety that had plagued me for 6 grueling months, the constant suffocating fear of Richard Thorne, tracking me down and balancing my life to zero, finally began to dissolve into the heavy, incense-scented air. I was sitting in a subterranean den surrounded by wolves, eating imported delicacies off pristine white porcelain, wearing a borrowed crown and a vintage diamond choker. It was a terrifying, morally complex, and incredibly dangerous environment. But as Dante leaned infinitesimally closer, his broad shoulder brushing against the burgundy silk of my gown, shielding me entirely from the hostile stares of the room, I knew the absolute truth. I was entirely, irrevocably safe, because the biggest, most dangerous wolf in the room was entirely mine. The first course was cleared, the silent servers moving with the precision of highly trained operatives. Dante engaged in a complex discussion regarding international freight logistics with a boss from the Chicago faction, his voice retaining that steady, resonant baritone that commanded the space without effort. I listened, my analytical mind automatically parsing the coded language, identifying the overlapping variables of their illicit shipping schedules, the same way I would track load distributions on a complex set of historical blueprints. My silence was not the terrified, submissive muteness Richard had demanded. It was a tactical, highly observant quiet. I was studying the structural dynamics of his empire. Halfway through the main course, a sleek, black smartphone placed discreetly next to Dante's water glass vibrated once. It was a completely silent notification, yet the microscopic shift in the underboss Marco's posture, standing in the deep shadows directly behind our chairs, indicated it was a priority alert. Dante did not break his conversation. He merely glanced down, his keen sight registering the information in a split second before the screen went dark. The muscle near his jaw twitched, the only physical tell that the information was hostile. He smoothly finished his sentence, taking a slow sip from his crystal wine glass before turning his attention fully to me. The shift was absolute, cutting the rest of the room off as if a heavy steel door had just slammed shut between us and the other syndicate bosses. "Are you finding the meal satisfactory, Clara?" he asked, his voice descending to a level of profound, terrifying intimacy, deliberately softening the harsh angles of his face. "It is excellent," I replied, matching his quiet volume, recognizing the unspoken tension vibrating just beneath the surface of his calm demeanor. My fingers tightened slightly around his. "Is there a structural issue we need to address?" The terminology slipped out naturally, a reflection of my professional mindset bridging the gap into his violent world. Dante's eyes flared with that same glimmer of deep, authentic respect I had seen in his private study. He recognized my competence, acknowledging that I was not a fragile, glass ornament to be sheltered from the truth, but a partner capable of processing the heavy load. "A minor stress fracture in the outer perimeter," Dante murmured, leaning in so close that the intoxicating scent of malt liquor and expensive cedar completely enveloped my senses. His lips barely moved, the words intended exclusively for my ears. Marco's intelligence network has flagged a localized disturbance near the financial district. A civilian auditor has been aggressively questioning lower-level associates about a woman matching your description. The breath completely left my lungs. Richard. He was here. My ex-husband had not given up. His arrogant, pathological need for absolute control had driven him to bypass his safe, corporate manipulation and actively seek out the shadows of the criminal underworld. The phantom ache in my ribs flared hot and sharp, the terrifying memory of his manicured hands bruising my skin rushing back with sickening clarity. The vintage diamonds around my neck suddenly felt incredibly heavy, a beautiful, sparkling collar threatening to choke me. I stared blindly at the pristine white tablecloth, my vision tunneling as the panic threatened to initiate a total systemic collapse. He was going to find me. He was going to stand in front of these lethal, calculating men and expose me as a fraud, a terrified victim hiding behind the emerald signet ring. He would tear down the foundation of Dante's carefully projected stability, leveraging my presence to destroy the DeLuca empire just as he had destroyed my independent life. But before the panic could fully take root, Dante's hands shifted. He didn't just hold my fingers. He engulfed my entire hand in his massive calloused grip, applying a firm, anchoring pressure that physically halted my spiraling thoughts. "Look at me, Clara," he commanded. It was not a request. I dragged my eyes up, forcing myself to meet his intense, unwavering gaze. There was no fear in his expression, no concern about the impending threat to his syndicate's reputation. There was only a cold, terrifying, and absolutely magnificent promise of catastrophic violence. "I told you this morning that if he took a single step toward you, I would break him so completely that his own shadow would forget him," Dante whispered, his tone a deep, gravelly rumble, vibrating straight through my chest. "Do you think I allow pests to chew through the foundation of my fortress?" I shook my head, a tiny fractured movement. "He is relentless, Dante. He uses the law, he uses leverage." "The law does not exist in this room," the sovereign protector stated flatly, his thumb resuming its slow, hypnotic stroke across the back of my hand, a steady rhythm that commanded my heart rate to match his absolute calm. "And leverage only works against men who have something to lose. I have already secured what is mine." He released my hand slowly, the loss of his physical warmth a sharp, immediate shock. But he didn't pull away. He reached up, his knuckles brushing incredibly lightly against the soft curve of my cheek, a gesture so profoundly tender and unexpected in the middle of a Mafia Council dinner that several conversations around the table faltered and died. The men watching saw a ruthless, untouchable sovereign displaying a moment of genuine, consuming affection for his new bride. They saw an impenetrable alliance. "Finish your wine, Clara," Dante instructed softly, dropping his hand and turning his attention back to the silent, waiting underboss in the shadows. "Marco, intercept the civilian, neutralize his search, feed him a dead-end trail, and put a tail on him. I want to know his every breath, but do not touch him yet. We play the long game." "Yes, boss," Marco replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp of absolute obedience before he melted seamlessly into the darkness of the corridor. I picked up the heavy crystal glass, the deep red wine catching the flickering light of the chandeliers. My hand was not shaking. The terrified, invisible woman who had run through the freezing rain 24 hours ago was dead, buried under layers of burgundy silk, vintage diamonds, and the absolute, terrifying protection of Dante DeLuca. I took a slow, measured sip, the rich, complex flavor blooming on my tongue. The dinner continued, the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the subterranean hall shifting around us, adapting to the undeniable reality of Dante's absolute control. Richard Thorne was currently walking into a meticulously designed, lethal trap, blinded by his own narcissistic arrogance, entirely unaware that an inescapable legal and strategic web was being spun around him by a man who wrote the rules in blood. And as I sat beside the apex predator, the heavy gold ring on my finger, acting as a unpermissioned, unyielding Kingsmead's crockery of my past, I realized the truest form of poetic justice wasn't just surviving. It was watching the architect of my nightmares walk blindly into a long-game trap, knowing his ultimate, highly publicized downfall was already guaranteed. The transition back to the DeLuca estate after the oppressive, high-stakes council dinner was a masterclass in silent efficiency. The armored convoy navigated the freezing, deserted streets of the financial district with predatory smoothness, the heavy SUVs cutting through the winter night like scalpels slicing through dark velvet. Inside the cabin, the pressurized air smelled faintly of expensive leather and the ozone of impending snow. Marco drove with lethal precision, his eyes constantly flicking between the rearview mirror and the street ahead, ensuring no rival syndicate vehicles had managed to tail us from the subterranean dining hall. We moved swiftly, tires gripping the icy asphalt, returning to the high-altitude sanctuary of the penthouse on Beacon Hill. The adrenaline that had sustained my posture, keeping my breathing steady when surrounded by the city's most ruthless men, was rapidly beginning to evaporate, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. I had survived my first trial as the fake bride of a sovereign protector. I had worn the bespoke fabrics and the blinding jewels, and I had watched the most dangerous man in Boston weaponize his entire empire simply to defend my right to sit beside him. The memory of Dante's warm, calloused hand engulfing mine beneath the white tablecloth remained a vivid, grounding sensation, a tactile anchor holding my fractured reality together. Every time a rival boss had looked at me with suspicion, Dante's thumb had brushed over my knuckles, a silent promise of violence against anyone who dared to question my place. I leaned my head against the cool-tinted glass of the window, watching the blur of streetlights, the antique piece weighing down my left hand, like a physical manifestation of his absolute command. Once inside the immense master suite, the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind me with the solid thud of a bank vault, the immediate need to decompress became overwhelming. The brutal storm that had hammered the city for 2 days had finally broken, leaving behind a brittle, freezing clarity. Moonlight filtered through the massive, reinforced bulletproof glass windows, casting long, pale geometric shadows across the plush, hand-woven wool rugs covering the imported hardwood floor. I walked toward the vanity, my reflection in the vast mirror looking like a stranger. A woman draped in syndicate wealth, shielded by a man who bowed to no one. I carefully unfastened the complex platinum clasp of the vintage diamond choker. The heavy, icy jewels slid off my skin with a soft, metallic whisper, pooling on the dark granite vanity. I placed the necklace reverently into its velvet box, tracing the edge of the intricate setting, still resting heavily on my left hand. It was the one piece of armor I would not remove. I changed out of the burgundy silk gown, unhooking the hidden corsetry with exhausted, trembling fingers. I was swapping the heavy engineered armor of a syndicate queen for the soft, familiar embrace of the dove-gray cashmere sweater and loose silk trousers that Gemma Rossesy, the meticulous housekeeper, had thoughtfully left out for me on the edge of the bed. The cashmere felt incredibly gentle against my healing ribs, a stark contrast to the rigid structure of the gown and the harsh realities of the night. The silence of the penthouse was usually a source of immense comfort, a pressurized barrier designed to keep the chaotic violence of the outside world at bay. Tonight, however, the quiet in the expansive living area was anything but hollow. It felt heavy, suffocating, charged with the brittle electricity of a coming storm. It hummed with the residual energy of the council dinner, and Marco Moretti's confirmed sighting of my ex-husband in the vicinity. Richard Thorne was actively searching for me in the lower levels of the city's criminal underworld, utilizing his corrupt financial connections to try and drag me back into his perfectly constructed nightmare. His narcissistic arrogance was completely blinding him to the fatal reality of the trap Dante was methodically setting. But knowing Richard was out there, breathing the same freezing Boston air, made the walls feel like they were closing in. I needed a distraction. I needed the familiar, logical structure of my professional work to calm the erratic, painful fluttering of my pulse. Architecture was safe. Blueprints did not lie. I needed to focus on load-bearing walls, masonry decay, and tensile strength, not on the sociopathic auditor hunting me through the winter night. I walked over to the elegantly carved antique writing desk, situated near the expansive corner windows. Inside the shallow top drawer lay the few personal items I had managed to salvage from my desperate flight. A cracked leather wallet, a set of useless apartment keys, and my old powered-down smartphone. I had kept the device strictly turned off since arriving at the estate, terrified that the corrupt financial auditor would use his illicit corporate resources to track the GPS signal. But I desperately needed a specific reference number from an old historic preservation file saved in the offline notes app. A project involving the structural reinforcement of 19th century Federalist brickwork. It was a harmless, deeply ingrained coping mechanism. By running the mathematical equations of masonry stress and weight distribution through my head, I could mentally map out a theoretical restoration, forcing my brain to process logic instead of fear. I just needed to access the offline file, retrieve the architectural data, and turn the device back off. 2 minutes at most. I pressed the cracked power button, holding my breath as the dark screen suddenly illuminated, casting a harsh, artificial blue glare in the dim room. The phone booted up slowly, instantly searching for an available cellular signal. I immediately swiped down to activate airplane mode, my thumb moving with practiced, frantic speed. I was 3 seconds too late. The device vibrated violently in my hand, a harsh, mechanical buzzing that sounded like a deafening siren in the perfectly silent room. It wasn't a single notification ping. It was a rapid, sequential barrage of incoming texts, the backlog of stored messages flooding through the momentary cellular connection before my thumb could tap the airplane icon to sever it. The cheap processor froze, overwhelmed by the sudden data transfer, displaying a cascading list of unread messages. The sender name displayed in bold black letters on the cracked glass screen felt like a sudden, catastrophic structural shift within my own chest. Richard. My thumb hovered erratically over the power button, the primal urge to shut the device down and run screaming echoing loudly in my ears. Every survival instinct told me to hide, to throw the phone against the granite floor until the glass shattered into 1,000 useless pieces. But the highly trained architectural conservator inside me, the woman who routinely analyzed catastrophic structural failures and assessed hidden damage beneath immaculate facades, demanded to see the full extent of the threat. You cannot reinforce a failing foundation if you blindly refuse to look at the cracks. I forced myself to lower my violently trembling thumb, opening the toxic message thread. The texts were not the frantic, misspelled pleas of a broken heart, nor were they the chaotic ramblings of a desperate man. They were meticulously crafted, grammatically perfect, and dripping with the exact cold, clinical cruelty that defined my ex-husband. Each sentence was constructed to maximize psychological damage, striking with the precision of a scalpel. I know where you are, Clara. Did you honestly believe a petty criminal could hide you from me? I saw the leaked encrypted chatter. I know you are wearing his ring. A mob boss? Really? That is incredibly low, even for you. You have exactly 24 hours to walk out of that estate and meet me at the Old Harbor office. Arrive alone. If you do not, I will immediately release the fabricated offshore ledgers I tied to your social security number. I will expose you as a thief and a fraud to the federal authorities, and I will make sure your new protector goes down in a federal indictment as your primary co-conspirator. I hold the silver flash drive, Clara. I write the narrative. Return right now, before I destroy his pristine new syndicate alliance with your dirty secrets. You know exactly what happens when you make me wait. The horrific words blurred together, the harsh blue light burning into my exhausted retinas. The psychological impact of his phrasing was a devastating, precision-guided missile aimed directly at my deepest insecurities. He wasn't just threatening my physical safety anymore. He was deliberately weaponizing my proximity to Dante. He was threatening to infect the insulated DeLuca empire with the fabricated, toxic financial crimes he had secretly woven into my name during our marriage. The stolen memory stick, an encrypted titanium drive I knew contained the definitive proof of his own illicit financial transactions and blackmail materials, was his ultimate leverage. He had framed me. He had built a complex paper trail designed specifically to destroy me if I ever dared to leave his control. And now, he was threatening to pull the trigger, bringing the sovereign protector down with me. Dante had offered me sanctuary, putting his own reputation and empire on the line to shield me, and I had accidentally handed Richard the perfect weapon to dismantle it all. A profound, suffocating wave of acute terror crashed over my exhausted biological system. My chest tightened painfully, the breath trapped agonizingly in my throat as the phantom sensation of his heavy, manicured fingers gripping my bruised ribs returned with horrifying clarity. The fading yellow bruises on my sides throbbed in sympathetic memory, a stark physical reminder of what Richard was capable of behind closed doors. I stared blankly at the phone, the physical manifestation of my worst nightmare glowing in the dark room. In the past, whenever Richard had presented me with a manufactured legal threat, my only option had been to submit, to apologize for crimes I hadn't committed, and to absorb the punishment in silence to protect the few people I cared about. The ingrained trauma response screamed at me to pack my borrowed clothes, to slip out of the warm penthouse into the freezing night, and to surrender myself at the harbor office to save Dante from the federal fallout. I actually took a hesitant step toward the mahogany door, the instinct to flee overriding my rational thought. But as my hand brushed against the soft fabric of my cashmere sweater, the raw emerald on my left hand caught the moonlight. The antique gold band felt incredibly solid against my skin, a heavy, unyielding anchor of ancient power cutting through the swirling chaos of my panic. I told you this morning that if he took a single step toward you, I would break him so completely that his own shadow would forget him. Dante's deep, intensely resonant vow echoed forcefully in my mind, slicing through the toxic, manipulative noise of Richard's text messages. Dante DeLuca did not operate on fear. He did not yield to corporate blackmail, and he certainly did not surrender what was his. He was the architecture of power itself. He had explicitly promised me absolute protection, and in return I had signed a legally binding marriage contract to be his partner. True partners did not hide critical threats. They did not cower in the shadows and let abusive blackmailers dictate the terms of their ongoing survival. I had brought a structural anomaly to him in the harbor blueprints, and now I had to bring this anomaly to him as well. I was no longer the same broken, isolated woman who had sprinted through the freezing rain on the night of the wedding. I was the fake bride of a criminal empire, and I was standing inside an impenetrable fortress. My professional competence was my weapon, and Dante was my shield. I gripped the phone tightly, my pale knuckles turning white, my jaw setting into a hard, uncompromising line of absolute defiance. I didn't turn the device off. I didn't delete the messages in a misguided attempt to hide my shame. Instead, I turned on my heel and walked purposefully out of the master suite. The soft silk of my trousers whispered against the floorboards as I navigated the quiet, dimly lit corridors of the massive penthouse. I wasn't running away. I was taking the threat directly to the apex predator. The expansive living area of the estate was bathed in the soft ambient glow of hidden architectural lighting, casting deep, dramatic shadows against the dark mahogany panels and imported granite floors. I moved silently through the grand space, my bare feet sinking deeply into the thick vintage rugs, tracking the faint, unmistakable aroma of aged spirits and crisp winter air toward the private study. The heavy double oak doors were slightly ajar, a sliver of warm golden light spilling out onto the hallway runner. I paused for a heartbeat, my erratic pulse drumming a frantic rhythm against my healing ribs, before pushing the door fully open. Dante was standing motionless by the massive bulletproof window, his broad back turned to the room as he stared out at the sprawling, glittering expanse of the frozen Boston skyline. He had discarded his charcoal suit jacket and unbuttoned his collar. The crisp white fabric of his bespoke shirt pulled taut across his heavy musculature. In his right hand, he casually held a heavy crystal tumbler containing 2 fingers of amber liquid. He looked like a solitary king surveying a kingdom he ruled through sheer, uncompromising force. The tension in his shoulders suggested he was already mapping out the destruction of anyone who had looked at me sideways during dinner. He didn't physically turn around when I entered, but his deep, resonant baritone filled the quiet space instantly. "You should be resting, Clara. The adrenaline from the council dinner usually demands a steep biological toll." I turned on my old phone. I stated immediately. My voice was a fragile, fractured whisper, but it didn't shake. I absolutely refused to let it shake. I only needed it for 2 minutes to access an offline architectural file. I didn't realize the cellular connection would push the queued messages through so fast. Dante froze. The absolute sudden stillness of his massive frame was infinitely more terrifying than any sudden, violent movement. He slowly turned away from the panoramic window, the ambient light catching the harsh, aristocratic angles of his jaw. His slate irises locked instantly onto the illuminated device trembling in my hand, and the temperature in the luxurious study plummeted to absolute zero. He didn't yell. He didn't reprimand me for the catastrophic security breach of activating an untraceable device inside his heavily fortified estate. He simply set his crystal tumbler down on the pristine surface of his mahogany desk, the soft click sounding exactly like a heavy gavel striking a judge's block. "Show me," he commanded softly, extending his large, scarred hand. I crossed the room, the distance feeling incredibly vast, and placed the phone onto his open palm. My fingers brushed briefly against his warm, calloused skin, a fleeting point of contact that sent a sharp, electric jolt of grounding energy up my arm. I stepped back, wrapping my arms tightly around my cashmere-clad ribs, watching as the sovereign protector, read the meticulous, toxic words of my abuser. I waited for the inevitable shift in his demeanor. I waited for the cold, calculating logic of the mafia boss to realize that I was exactly the massive liability his capo had warned him about. Richard was threatening to involve federal authorities, utilizing fabricated offshore ledgers and the encrypted device to dismantle the syndicate's pristine financial front. In the corporate world, this level of blackmail would trigger immediate panic, asset liquidation, and the swift severance of all ties with the compromised individual. I braced myself for Dante to hand the phone back, to calmly inform me that the risk was too high, and to void the marriage contract. Instead, Dante's jaw tightened, the muscle ticking violently beneath his skin. The civilized veneer of the stoic sovereign slipped, revealing a dark, terrifying glimpse of the absolute brutality that lay just beneath the surface. His eyes did not reflect panic or strategic retreat. They reflected a cold, localized apocalypse. Every predator instinct in the room zeroed in on the threat to what belonged to him. "Marco," Dante said. The single word was not shouted, but it possessed a specific, lethal frequency that carried an unspoken, absolute command through the penthouse. Within 15 seconds, the underboss materialized in the doorway, his charcoal suit impeccably neat, his face carved from unyielding granite. Marco assessed the scene in an instant. My defensive posture, the illuminated civilian phone in his boss's hand, and the terrifying, contained fury radiating from Dante's massive frame. "Boss," Marco acknowledged, stepping fully into the room, his hand resting instinctively near the concealed weapon inside his jacket. I watched the two men lock into an unspoken, lethal synchronization, a profound wave of relief, finally anchoring my erratic pulse. By surrendering the phone to Dante, I had officially stopped running, choosing to trust the impenetrable sanctuary of the sovereign protector as the long night shifted toward a new, decisive dawn. "The civilian auditor has escalated his timeline," Dante stated, speaking with a rough, gravelly rasp that vibrated with suppressed violence. He tossed the phone onto the desk, the device sliding sharply across the leather surface. "He has managed to intercept lower-level encrypted chatter regarding the wedding. He is threatening to use a fabricated paper trail and a silver flash drive to frame Clara for federal embezzlement, if she does not surrender herself at the Old Harbor office within 24 hours. Marco's dead eyes shifted to the phone, processing the tactical variables with mechanical precision. "Activating that device here means he might have pinged the nearest cell tower, boss. He doesn't have our exact coordinates, but he knows she is within a 3-mile radius of the Beacon Hill sector. Then we lock the sector down," Dante ordered, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for debate. "I want the outer perimeter security of this estate tripled immediately. No vehicle approaches the gates without a full ballistic and manifest sweep. You will deploy the surveillance teams to the Old Harbor office. I want every camera, every shadow, and every point of entry monitored. If Richard Thorne steps foot in that district, I want to know his exact heart rate." "Understood," Marco replied smoothly, already pulling out his own encrypted device to initiate the lockdown protocols. "And the federal threat? If he possesses this encrypted device, he could attempt to leak the fabricated ledgers to the authorities before we secure him." "Let him try," Dante sneered, a dark, devastatingly arrogant smirk touching the corner of his mouth. "The federal authorities in this city answer to my payroll, Marco. If he walks into a field office with that drive, he will find himself detained for corporate espionage before he reaches the front desk. But he won't go to the feds. His ego requires him to handle this personally. He wants to break Clara himself." The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his power washed over me, a tidal wave of dark money, and absolute control that completely eclipsed Richard's petty corporate manipulations. Dante was not scrambling to defend his empire. He was effortlessly rearranging the board to ensure his enemy walked blindly into an inescapable trap. Marco gave a single respectful nod, fully accepting the parameters of the impending war. "I will handle the security escalation and the harbor deployment immediately." The underboss turned on his heel and vanished back into the quiet corridors of the penthouse, leaving the heavy air of the study humming with lethal purpose. I stood frozen in the center of the room, my arms still wrapped tightly around my ribs. The phantom pain of my bruises ached in time with my racing pulse. Richard's words were still burning in my mind, a toxic echo of the isolation and helplessness he had forced upon me for years. "You know exactly what happens when you make me wait." Dante moved away from the desk, closing the distance between us with a slow, deliberate grace that demanded my complete attention. He stopped just inches away, his towering frame casting a protective, impenetrable shadow over me. The scent of aged whiskey and crisp winter air enveloped me, driving out the stale, suffocating memory of my abuser. "You are shaking again," Dante observed quietly, his intense focus dropping to where my pale, trembling fingers were clutching the soft cashmere of my sweater. "He always wins, Dante," I whispered, the exhaustion finally cracking my voice. "He builds these perfect, inescapable cages out of paper and legal threats. He convinces everyone that he is the victim and I am the unstable, hysterical liability. He holds that silver flash drive." "Clara." Dante's deep voice cut through my spiraling panic, firm and absolute. He reached out, his large, scarred hands gently but firmly taking my trembling wrists, pulling my arms away from my chest. He was incredibly careful not to press on the fading yellow bruises along my ribs, his thumbs resting securely on the unblemished skin of my palms. "Look at me." I forced my eyes up, meeting his intense, unwavering gaze. "Richard Thorne is a man who builds cages out of paper," Dante murmured, his voice descending to a level of profound, terrifying intimacy that sent an electric shock straight down my spine. "But I am a man who burns buildings to the ground. His ledgers, his flash drives, his corporate leverage. They are completely useless against a force that does not acknowledge his rules. He thinks he is playing a game of chess. He does not realize I have already flipped the board." He lifted my left hand, his thumb brushing slowly, reverently over the heavy gold of the emerald signet ring. The contrast between his absolute lethality and this quiet domestic tenderness was staggering. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do tonight," Dante continued. His storm gray eyes softened into a mesmerizing, protective warmth that made my breath catch. "You didn't run. You didn't hide the threat. You brought it to me. You trusted the foundation we built this morning." "I ceased the marriage contract," I replied softly, the truth of the statement settling deep into my bones. "I am your partner." "You are my wife," Dante corrected seamlessly, his tone a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He slowly released my right hand, raising his fingers to gently trace the line of my jaw, a touch so restrained and tender contrasted violently with the brutal orders he had just issued to his capo. "And tomorrow, we are going to watch the architect of your nightmares walk directly into the fire. But tonight you will sleep. You are safe here, Clara. Absolutely." I leaned infinitesimally into his touch, the last remnants of the freezing Boston storm finally leaving my soul. The text messages on the phone behind him no longer felt like a death sentence. They felt like a desperate, pathetic plea from a ghost who didn't yet realize he was already dead. Surrounded by immaculate granite, bulletproof glass, and the overwhelming, terrifying protection of the sovereign mafia boss, I finally understood the true meaning of poetic justice. It wasn't just surviving the abuse. It was standing securely in the light while the abuser was consumed by the dark. I closed my eyes that night, letting the profound weight of Dante's promise anchor my fractured spirit into a deep, dreamless sleep. But peace in the underworld was always a fleeting illusion. The atmosphere inside the DeLuca estate shifted drastically overnight, transforming from a quiet, pressurized sanctuary into an active, lethal command center. The ambient stillness of the penthouse was entirely replaced by the low, continuous hum of encrypted servers and the sharp, staccato rhythm of tactical preparations. I had spent the early hours of the morning pacing the perimeter of the master suite, my bare feet sinking deeply into the plush vintage rugs, my mind racing through the mathematical probabilities of my own survival. Thorne's ultimatum was a ticking clock echoing in my skull, a 24-hour countdown to a localized apocalypse that threatened to consume the only safe haven I had ever known. I expected Dante to keep me isolated in the bedroom, shielded from the violent mechanics of his syndicate's response. In my previous marriage, whenever a corporate crisis emerged, the corrupt auditor would lock me out of his home office, aggressively demanding my absolute silence and invisibility, while he manipulated his illicit ledgers. Richard had thrived on keeping me blind. He had weaponized my lack of information to enforce my dependency. But Dante DeLuca did not operate on the principles of isolation and enforced ignorance. He did not build cages disguised as homes. Shortly before noon, Gemma Rossi arrived at my door, her silver-streaked hair pulled back into its characteristic, unyielding bun. She did not bring me tea or soothing platitudes. She brought a crisp, tailored black blazer to wear over my dove-gray cashmere sweater, her hands moving with an efficient maternal warmth as she smoothed the lapels. With a quiet nod, she politely informed me that the Sovereign Protector required my presence in the subterranean tactical room. The descent into the lower levels of the Beacon Hill estate was a masterclass in hidden, defensive architecture. The biometric elevator bypassed the opulent residential floors entirely, opening into a sprawling windowless chamber forged from raw concrete, unpolished granite, and exposed steel girders. The air down here was drastically colder, carrying the sharp metallic tang of overheated servers and impending war. Heavy cables snaked across the unpolished granite floor, feeding power into the immense servers that processed the DeLuca Syndicate's global intelligence. It was a space designed exclusively for the orchestration of war, completely devoid of the domestic comforts of the upper floors. There were no plush rugs here, no warm fireplaces, only the brutal, calculated geometry of survival. In the center of the room, standing over a massive illuminated smart table, displaying complex digital schematics, were Dante and Marco Moretti. Dante had discarded his suit jacket entirely. The crisp white fabric of his dress shirt rolled up to the elbows, revealing the dark, intricate syndicate ink wrapping around his heavy, muscular forearms. A dark leather shoulder holster was strapped securely across his broad chest, the matte black grip of a customized firearm resting flawlessly against his ribs. He looked like a sovereign absolute in his territory, radiating a terrifying coiled energy that immediately commanded the vast space. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming. As I cautiously approached the digital table, Marco looked up, his face carved from impenetrable stone. The underboss did not offer a polite greeting. He tapped a rapid, encrypted sequence onto the glowing glass surface, expanding a three-dimensional wireframe model of a massive, ornate building that I instantly recognized as the Grand Assembly Hall. "The civilian auditor has not remained stationary, boss," Marco reported, his gravelly voice cutting through the hum of the servers. He deliberately kept his dead eyes fixed on the holographic projection, though his tactical awareness of my presence was absolute. Our surveillance teams at the harbor office confirmed Thorne never actually expected Clara to show up. The text messages were a diversionary tactic to gauge our response time. He has spent the last 12 hours aggressively leveraging his corporate connections to broker a desperate, backdoor alliance with a rival faction. My breath hitched painfully, the fading yellow bruises on my ribs giving a sympathetic throb against the fine cashmere of my sweater. The rival faction was represented by the very men we had dined with the previous evening in the subterranean dining hall. Men who had looked at me with cold, calculating suspicion, openly challenging the structural integrity of my sudden marriage to the sovereign leader. They were sharks, circling blood in the water, looking for any fracture in Dante's impenetrable armor. Dante's jaw tightened, a microscopic shift that conveyed an ocean of lethal intent. He did not look at me, his dark vision locked onto the digital blueprints with a terrifying, absolute focus. "Explain the exact parameters of his leverage, Marco." "Thorne is offering them the stolen memory stick," the capo explained, pulling up a secondary screen detailing complex offshore financial pathways. "He is promising to hand over the fabricated embezzlement ledgers and the encrypted corporate blackmail that he explicitly tied to Clara's identity. If the rival bosses possess that device, they can use it to cripple our legitimate financial fronts and trigger massive federal indictments across our entire eastern supply chain, effectively paralyzing the harbor operations. In exchange for the data, the opposing faction has agreed to smuggle Thorne into the Grand Syndicate Gala this evening, bypassing our external checkpoints completely." The absolute magnitude of the threat settled heavily onto my chest, suffocating the air from my lungs. The annual Syndicate Gala was the premier gathering of the Underworld Commission, a highly publicized, heavily secured event where Dante was expected to formally present me to the unified families as his untouchable queen. The marriage contract had legally bound us, but the gala was the public ratification. It was the keystone of his entire political strategy, designed to cement his absolute authority. "Their objective is theatrical exposure," Dante deduced instantly, his voice falling to a low, gravelly depth that physically shook the cold air in the tactical room. "They intend to put the corrupt auditor in the middle of the ballroom. They want him to publicly confront Clara, lay claim to her as a fleeing victim of domestic abuse, and present scripted drive to the commission as irrefutable proof that my new marriage is a hollow, desperate fraud." They want to fracture the DeLuca Empire's perceived stability in front of every rival boss on the seaboard. Exactly, Marco confirmed grimly, swiping away the financial data to bring the venue's schematic back into sharp focus. If they expose the marriage as a fake, our shipping alliance crumbles. The Commission will view you as compromised, and the rival syndicate will immediately petition to absorb our territories. We have tripled the biometric security parameters at the building, but the opposing bosses have legitimate invitations. They have the clearance to bypass the primary weapon scanners. If they bring him inside embedded within their personal entourage, intercepting him without triggering a massive public shootout on the gala floor will be nearly impossible. I stared at the glowing blue wireframe of the structure, my heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against my sternum. Richard was utilizing the exact same psychological warfare he had subjected me to for years, creating an inescapable scenario where my mere existence became a catastrophic liability to the people around me, forcing me to surrender to avoid collateral damage. He was going to walk into a room full of dangerous syndicates, armed with the stolen data and his sickening, manicured charm, and meticulously tear down the fortress Dante had built to protect me. The thought made my blood crystallize in my veins. We cancel the appearance, Marco suggested, his tone purely pragmatic, assessing the risk-to-reward ratio with cold efficiency. We lock the estate down, pull our assets back behind the reinforced walls, and hunt Thorn in the streets on our own timeline. No, Dante's command was instantaneous, slicing through the underboss's tactical retreat with brutal, unyielding finality. The single word cracked like a gunshot in the freezing chamber. If we do not attend the gala, we validate their suspicions. The DeLuca Syndicate does not hide behind reinforced gates because a parasite threatens to chew on the foundation. We attend. We let them attempt the infiltration. We crush them in the light. They want a public spectacle, Marco. We will give them an execution. Boss, the hall has 12 secondary access points. Marco argued respectfully, gesturing to the complex digital schematic glowing between them. The rival faction knows our standard security deployment. They will systematically search for the structural blind spot in the perimeter to slip him through before the main procession begins. I looked down at the glowing architectural rendering of the venue, forcing the rising tide of sheer panic back down my throat. My professional mind, trained over years of meticulous historical preservation work, automatically began dissecting the three-dimensional layout. The digital blueprint displayed the grand ballrooms, the modern security vestibules, and the sweeping marble staircases, but it was a sanitized, modern rendering. It lacked the true chaotic history of the structure. It was mathematically flawless, but historically ignorant. This blueprint is incomplete, I stated. The silence that followed in the freezing tactical room was profound. It screamed like a siren in a silent room. Marco turned his head slowly, his hard, granite-carved features registering my sudden intrusion into syndicate strategy with deep, unconcealed skepticism. Even Dante shifted his stance, his sharp gaze moving from the digital table to my pale face, waiting in absolute stillness. He did not dismiss me. He did not order me to step back into the shadows. He simply watched, granting me the floor with an absolute, terrifying respect. I stepped closer to the illuminated glass surface, my trembling fingers gripping the cold, metallic edge of the table to anchor myself in the freezing room. I was terrified, yes, but the architectural data stored in my brain was absolute. It was the one thing my former abuser had never managed to beat out of me. I worked on the preservation assessment for this exact building 3 years ago, I explained, my voice gaining strength as the familiar, logical rules of masonry and structural engineering pushed the blinding fear aside. I reached out, extending one finger to tap the digital rendering of the east wing's exterior wall. This modern schematic shows a solid, continuous load-bearing wall along the eastern perimeter. But the structure suffered a massive, undocumented internal fire in 1912. The original architects hastily retrofitted the foundation to prevent a total collapse. There is a secondary, degraded limestone service corridor directly behind this modern drywall, originally designed for staff to move coal and heavy supplies, without disturbing the main events. Marco frowned heavily, his thick fingers flying across the digital keyboard, immediately pulling up municipal city planning records and overlapping them on the screen. There are no subterranean service corridors listed on the city's official structural grid, because it was permanently sealed off during a renovation in the 1950s. and deliberately scrubbed from the public ledgers to bypass modern fire safety codes, I countered, my eyes locking fearlessly onto the capo's skeptical gaze. The fine cashmere of my sweater pulled painfully tight across my chest as I dragged a shallow, uneven breath, my bare fingertips turning entirely numb against the freezing smooth glass of the smart table. I could feel the rhythmic, panicked hammering of my own heart, yet I forced my voice to remain perfectly steady. I watched a single, rigid muscle feather along Dante's sharp jawline as he processed the structural impossibility I was proposing. It connects the outer blind alleyway directly to the dead space behind the main ballroom's coat check. The masonry is porous, crumbling mortise and tenon joinery that could easily be breached with basic hand tools. If the opposing faction has done their homework, they won't try to walk him through the biometric scanners. They will breach the limestone corridor, bypass the metal detectors entirely, and slip him directly into the inner sanctum undetected. Marco stared at me for 3 long, agonizing seconds. The heavy silence stretched. He pressed a rapid sequence on his encrypted tablet, cross-referencing my historical data with underground municipal utility maps and seismic ground-penetrating radar scans. Slowly, the digital rendering on the smart table updated, highlighting a narrow, jagged red line running exactly where I had indicated. A hidden artery bypassing the very heart of their $1 million security net. The underboss looked up, the deep, ingrained suspicion in his eyes finally cracking, replaced by a stark, undeniable gleam of profound professional respect. He looked at Dante, his posture shifting slightly to acknowledge my contribution. She's right. It's a fatal blind spot in the perimeter. If they use that corridor, they bypass our entire security net completely. Dante did not look at the updated blueprint. He was looking exclusively at me. The terrifying, cold fury that had radiated from his massive frames, just moments ago, had transformed into something infinitely more dangerous. A dark, overwhelming, and deeply possessive pride. He recognized that I wasn't just a fragile civilian seeking temporary shelter behind his guns. I was actively handing him the architecture of his enemy's absolute destruction. I was no longer a victim. I was a vital asset. It was a blind spot, Dante murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sent a sharp electric jolt straight down my spine. He turned his intense attention back to Marco, his tactical command snapping back into flawless, lethal execution. Not anymore. Marco, do not seal that corridor. Reinforce the outer alleyway to secretly guarantee it is the only viable covert entry point they can find. I want you to meticulously funnel them exactly where Clara has predicted. You want to let them inside the perimeter? Marco asked, though his massive hands were already moving across the keyboard to execute the new deployment order. I want to turn the degraded limestone service corridor into a fatal choke point, Dante corrected coldly, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. Let the rival faction breach the wall. Let them smuggle her ex-husband into the dark. And when the corrupt auditor is completely severed from his heavily armed allies, trapped in a soundproof, unmapped tunnel beneath the gala, you will be waiting for him. Recover then, sure, Mr. Thorne permanently forgets how to speak. Understood, boss, Marco replied, a grim, lethal satisfaction deeply coloring his tone. The strategy was set. The trap was meticulously designed not just with brutal syndicate violence, but with my specific, hard-earned intellectual competence. I took a slow, measured breath, the stale, metallic air of the tactical room suddenly feeling incredibly clear in my lungs. Richard had spent years isolating me, systematically convincing me that my skills were useless and my existence was a burden. Yet here, standing shoulder to shoulder with the most dangerous men in the city, my specialized knowledge was the keystone, holding the entire defensive structure together. Dante reached across the digital table, his calloused fingers brushing lightly, deliberately against the dark sleeve of my blazer. You gave us the map, Clara. I will handle the execution. Go upstairs and prepare for the gala. This evening, you wear the crown. Hours later, the winter sun bled out across the Boston skyline, casting bruised, violent purple shadows over the city, before plunging it into deep twilight. I stood perfectly still in the center of the master suite, staring out the massive, reinforced, bulletproof glass window, as the first heavy white flakes of snow began to fall from the blackened sky. The ambient temperature inside the luxurious room was perfectly regulated, warm and smelling faintly of the soothing lavender Gemma had used to press my clothes, but my internal architecture was vibrating with a severe localized tension. The gala was less than an hour away. Gemma had just finished the final preparations, meticulously helping me into a stunning, custom-tailored gown of midnight blue velvet. Unlike the heavy, corseted burgundy silk gown from the council dinner, this garment was designed for fluid, deceptive grace. It featured long, elegant sleeves that completely concealed my fading bruises, and a high sculpted neckline that required no heavy vintage diamond choker to project authority. The rich fabric moved like liquid shadow, absorbing the soft ambient light of the bedroom. I looked like a woman who genuinely belonged in the terrifying, opulent world of the syndicate elite. But beneath the immaculate velvet, my erratic pulse was drumming a relentless, fearful rhythm against my ribs. The heavy mahogany door clicked open with a soft, decisive sound. I didn't turn around immediately, my eyes remaining fixed on the swirling snow outside the thick glass. I knew exactly who it was. The sudden, intense shift in the room's air pressure and the familiar, intoxicating scent of aged whiskey and crisp winter air heralded his arrival. Dante DeLuca stepped into the intimate space, his footsteps completely silent against the vintage rugs. He moved to stand directly beside me, his massive frame radiating an overwhelming, consuming heat that starkly contrasted with the freezing storm raging beyond the glass. He was dressed in impeccable, formal black tie attire, the dark tuxedo tailored flawlessly to his broad shoulders, projecting a civilized, aristocratic facade that barely contained the ruthless sovereign underneath. A bespoke charcoal overcoat hung effortlessly over his arm, the rich fabric an undeniable symbol of the immense, untethered wealth at his disposal. He looked breathtaking. He looked lethal. The silence between us stretched, not empty or awkward, but heavily pressurized with the unspoken gravity of what we were about to walk into. My former abuser was currently maneuvering through the dark, icy streets below, clutching the stolen data, absolutely certain he was about to orchestrate my total destruction and drag Dante's empire down with me. "You are calculating the stress points again," Dante observed quietly, his deep baritone vibrating in the quiet, intimate room. I swallowed hard, wrapping my arms loosely around my velvet-clad waist in a lingering instinct of self-protection. The luxurious fabric offered little defense against the cold memories threatening to surface. In my past life, whenever I attended a high-profile corporate event with Richard, I spent the entire evening mapping out the exits. I had to calculate exactly how many drinks he consumed, analyzing the microscopic shifts in his tone to predict how violent the car ride home was going to be. If his smile grew too wide, it meant I had spoken out of turn. If he gripped my wrist beneath the table, it meant a fracture was imminent. I lived in a constant, exhausting state of structural collapse. I finally turned my head, looking up into his intense, storm-gray eyes. The harsh, uncompromising lines of his jaw were relaxed, his unreadable expression searching my face. "This evening, I am about to walk into a ballroom filled with powerful syndicates who actively want to tear me down to find a vulnerability in you," I whispered, the raw, unvarnished truth slipping out. "If I hesitate, if I show them even a fraction of the fear I am carrying, I will fail you. I will become the exact liability Marco warned you about in the vestry." Dante did not offer a polite, dismissive reassurance. He didn't tell me that my fears were unfounded, because in the brutal reality of the criminal underworld, my fears were entirely accurate. Instead, he slowly turned his body to fully face me, his broad shoulders completely blocking out the snow and the sprawling, dangerous city beyond the glass. He reached out, his large, scarred hands gently capturing my trembling fingers. He avoided the healing yellow contusions on my left wrist entirely, his calloused thumb coming to rest, deliberately, against the heavy gold of the emerald signet ring. The heat from his skin immediately began to melt away the frost in my veins. The tactile contrast between his lethal reputation and the staggering gentleness of his touch was profoundly disorienting. It made my breath hitch. "You misunderstand the fundamental architecture of this arrangement, Clara," Dante murmured, his tone taking on a level of cold, absolute finality that commanded every fractured piece of my attention. "You cannot fail me, because you do not work for me. You are not a soldier tasked with holding a perimeter, and you are not a corporate asset required to perfectly balance a ledger." He took a half step closer. The physical proximity was overwhelming, stripping away the oxygen in the room, until all I could breathe was the clean scent of cedar and the intoxicating, deeply romantic danger of his presence. "I do not protect you because you wear my ring," Dante stated, the absolute unyielding conviction in his tone, echoing like an unbreakable vow. You wear my ring because I chose to protect you. The men in that ballroom this evening will not see a terrified fugitive hiding from a corrupt financial auditor. They will see the woman who walked into a tactical briefing and effortlessly handed me the exact blueprint to destroy my enemies. They will see a mind sharper than any blade in this city. My breath caught painfully in my throat, the last lingering remnants of my ex-husband's insidious gaslighting psychological abuse fracturing and falling away under the crushing, magnificent weight of Dante's absolute validation. He wasn't just shielding my body from physical harm. He was systematically restoring my intellectual pride, reinforcing the crumbling foundation of my self-worth with dark, unbreakable steel. He recognized my competence. He respected my strength. Dante slowly released my fingers. His hand moved upward, his rough knuckles brushing incredibly lightly against the soft curve of my jawline. The touch was so restrained, so agonizingly gentle from a man capable of orchestrating absolute, fatal violence, that a profound, undeniable shiver raced straight down my spine. It was a moment of intense, unspoken, romantic tension, the heavy air thick with the realization that the transactional boundaries of the marriage contract had entirely dissolved. The emotional safety he provided was no longer a legal obligation. It was a devastating, undeniable reality. The choke point is set in the limestone corridor, Dante promised quietly, his thumb tracing the delicate edge of my cheekbone, his calculating stare tracking invisible vectors. Marco is waiting in the dark. Richard's long game ends this night. He will never write another ledger, and he will never cause you to map out an exit again. I leaned infinitesimally into his touch, the soft velvet of my gown brushing against the fine bespoke wool of his tuxedo. The extreme safety fantasy I had desperately craved was no longer a distant illusion. It was standing right in front of me, fully armed and absolutely devoted to my survival. "I am ready," I said. My voice did not shake. It was a quiet, definitive statement of absolute trust. Dante offered a dark, magnificent shadow of a smile. He dropped his hand, offering me his arm with a quiet, lethal grace. The Grand Assembly Hall was a masterpiece of Gilded Age architecture, a sprawling, opulent cavern of marble and gold leaf that was completely at odds with the violent, treacherous nature of the men currently occupying it. As the heavy brass-studded doors swung open to admit us, the overwhelming sensory impact of the Syndicate Gala washed over me in a tidal wave of sound and light. Massive crystal chandeliers hung suspended from the soaring vaulted ceilings, refracting the harsh, brilliant illumination across the polished terrazzo floors. The air was thick, heavily saturated with the competing scents of imported champagne, expensive perfumes, and the sharp, underlying metallic tang of concealed weapons and paranoid aggression. Hundreds of the city's most dangerous and influential figures moved through the glittering space, their bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns forming a shifting, vibrant mosaic of illicit power. In my past life, walking into a high-society corporate function had always felt like stepping onto a battlefield, completely unarmed. My every movement dictated by the cruel, whispered criticisms of the corrupt financial auditor who owned me. But tonight, the dynamic was fundamentally, irreversibly altered. I did not walk slightly behind my partner, head bowed to avoid drawing unwanted attention. I walked perfectly in step with Dante, my hand resting lightly but securely in the crook of his arm. The midnight blue velvet of my gown moved with a heavy, fluid grace, the structural engineering of the garment enforcing a posture of absolute, unshakable royalty. The heavy gold of the emerald signet ring on my left hand felt less like a piece of jewelry and more like a physical anchor, a solid weight grounding me in the chaotic, dangerous environment. Every time a rival boss or a calculating syndicate wife turned their gaze toward us, their eyes inevitably dropped to the raw green stone, and I felt the air pressure shift. They were not looking at a terrified fugitive. They were looking at the sovereign protector's chosen queen. The mafia boss did not smile, nor did he make any overt, theatrical gestures of dominance. He simply existed beside me, his massive frame radiating a dark, coiled energy that effortlessly parted the crowded room. We moved through the ballroom, the strategic choreography of the evening already in motion. Marco had positioned his most trusted men around the perimeter, their charcoal suits blending seamlessly into the shadowed alcoves. The trap was set in the degraded limestone service corridor, the unmapped architectural blind spot I had identified earlier that day. The rival faction, eager to expose Dante's sudden marriage as a fraudulent liability, had undoubtedly smuggled Richard into the venue through the compromised East Wing. Now, it was a matter of executing the final phase of the operation. The eastern vestibule, Dante murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated exclusively for my ears beneath the swell of classical music provided by the string quartet. His sharp vision swept over the glittering crowd, tracking invisible vectors of threat with terrifying precision. The underboss is holding the perimeter. You'll walk toward the coat check. Do not hesitate, Clara. The moment he reveals himself, the jaws of the trap will snap shut. I know, I whispered back, my voice steady, betraying none of the lingering biological fear that hummed beneath my skin. I squeezed his arm briefly, drawing one final, vital surge of strength from his immense body heat. With a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, Dante released me, turning his attention to a high-ranking capo from the Chicago faction who had approached to offer a formal greeting. It was the signal. I stepped away from the blinding light of the chandeliers, navigating the crowded edges of the grand ballroom with the precise, deliberate grace Gemma Rossi had instilled in me. I did not rush. A queen does not run. I moved past the towering marble columns, my professional mind automatically assessing the structural integrity of the archways to keep my focus absolute. The transition from the loud, opulent main hall to the secluded eastern corridor was stark and immediate. The heavy acoustic paneling absorbed the music and the chaotic chatter, leaving only the soft, muffled whisper of my velvet gown brushing against the polished stone floor. The lighting here was deliberately dim, casting long, dramatic shadows against the dark mahogany wainscoting. The air grew noticeably cooler, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of dry mortar and century-old dust leaking from the hidden service tunnel just beyond the plaster walls. I stopped near the heavy, arched doorway that led toward the coat check, perfectly positioning myself in the designated kill zone. I stared at the intricate geometric patterns carved into the wooden frame, forcing my erratic pulse to slow down, counting the seconds in my head. Clara. The voice sliced through the quiet corridor like a rusted scalpel. I did not flinch. I did not gasp or scramble backward in blind panic. The woman who would have reacted that way had died in the freezing rain 24 hours ago. I turned slowly, the midnight blue velvet pooling elegantly around my feet, and faced the architect of my nightmares. Richard Thorne stepped out from the deep shadow of an adjacent alcove. He was wearing a meticulously tailored black tuxedo, his sandy hair perfectly coiffed, his white-toothed smile plastered across his handsome patrician face. To the untrained eye, he looked like a wealthy, respectable corporate executive attending a high-society charity event. But my eyes were highly trained. I saw the manic, desperate twitch in his jaw, the erratic, rapid dilation of his pupils, and the thin sheen of nervous sweat coating his forehead. The cloying, expensive scent of his cologne hit me, a sensory trigger that used to paralyze my vocal cords and send me into a spiral of submissive obedience. Tonight, it just smelled pathetic. I have to admit, Clara, you have exceeded my expectations, Richard said, his voice dripping with that familiar, toxic condescension. He took a step closer, his eyes darting frantically up and down the corridor to ensure we were alone. When you ran out into the rain, I thought I would find you shivering in a women's shelter. Instead, I find you playing dress-up with the most dangerous mafia boss in Boston. It is a spectacular, suicidal leap, but the game ends right now. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket, pulling out the silver flash drive. The encrypted titanium device caught the dim light, a small, physical manifestation of the immense leverage he believed he held over my entire existence. This drive contains the fabricated offshore ledgers, the corrupt financial auditor hissed, closing the distance between us until he was less than 3 feet away. It contains enough meticulously planted evidence to send you to federal prison for a decade, and enough collateral damage to drag your new protector into a massive RICO indictment. The men who brought me into this building are waiting just outside the perimeter. If I don't walk out of here with you in the next 3 minutes, they will hand copies of this data directly to the commission. His syndicate will collapse, and they will execute you just to tie up the loose ends. He reached out, his manicured fingers aiming directly for my left wrist, fully intending to wrap his hand around the fading yellow bruises he had inflicted. It was his signature move. A physical assertion of absolute control designed to break my psychological foundation. I stepped back, a fluid, deliberate movement that placed me entirely out of his reach. The cold metal of my wedding band flashed brilliantly as I raised my hand, a silent, unyielding barrier between his toxicity and my healing skin. You don't understand the architecture of this building, Richard, I stated calmly, my voice echoing with a cold, analytical detachment that made him freeze mid-motion. And you certainly don't understand the architecture of the men who own it. He scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound, though a flicker of genuine confusion finally cracked his arrogant facade. You have lost your mind. The trauma has finally broken you. I am your only salvation. Come with me right now, and I will erase the ledgers. I will forgive this pathetic rebellion. You are a parasite who builds cages out of paper, I quoted quietly, the empowering words of the sovereign protector fueling my absolute defiance. But you are standing in a fortress forged from dark steel and absolute violence. You didn't infiltrate this gala. You were funneled here. You walked blindly into a fatal choke point, because you were too arrogant to realize the blueprints you relied on were fundamentally flawed. The blood completely drained from his face. The psychological warfare he was so accustomed to wielding had suddenly, catastrophically failed. He looked at me, truly looking at me, and saw the absolute absence of fear. I was not the shattered, isolated woman he had audited into submission. I was the keystone of the trap. Before he could process the terrifying implication of my words, the temperature in the corridor plummeted to absolute zero. The heavy, mahogany-paneled wall directly behind Richard, the wall concealing the degraded limestone service corridor I had identified on the smart table, did not open with a loud crash. It slid open with a whisper-quiet, lethal precision, revealing the dark, unmapped artery of the estate. The quiet in the corridor lacked any real peace. It grew heavy, suffocating, and tasted of ancient mortar and imminent retribution. The shadows themselves seemed to detach from the wall and step into the dim light. Dante materialized first, his massive frame completely blocking the hidden entrance, his charcoal overcoat draped over his broad shoulders like the executioner's mantle. The smell of aged whiskey and freezing winter air instantly overpowered the ex-husband's cloying cologne. Marco stepped out a moment later, his movement silent and predatory, instantly moving to cut off the only exit leading back to the grand ballroom. Richard spun around, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished stone floor, a pathetic, strangled gasp escaping his throat as he came face to face with the apex predator. The financial auditor, who terrorized women in the absolute privacy of soundproofed homes and manipulated corporate assets behind legal firewalls, was suddenly confronted with raw, unadulterated, and inescapable violence. Mr. Thorne, Dante rumbled, producing a deep, gravelly resonance vibrating through the floorboards, carrying the weight of a sovereign decree. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I believe you possess property that belongs to my syndicate. The abuser took a frantic step backward, instinctively trying to put distance between himself and the towering mafia boss. But his back hit the cold stone wall. He held the silver flash drive up, his hand shaking so violently the titanium casing rattled against his knuckles. Stay back. The rival faction, the men who brought me in, they know I am here. If I don't return, they will trigger the federal indictments. They will destroy your alliance. Dante tilted his head slightly, a gesture of dark, devastating amusement that sent a chill straight through the marrow of my bones. He took one slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance with the effortless grace of a man who owned the very air Richard was struggling to breathe. The rival faction who brought you here, Dante murmured, his merciless stare entirely devoid of pity, was intercepted at the outer biometric perimeter 20 minutes ago, when the capo presented them with the undeniable proof that they were attempting to smuggle a federal informant into a commission gathering. They were faced with a choice. They could either declare war against the DeLuca Empire on the floor of the gala, or they could surrender their access to the eastern shipping routes and abandon you in the walls. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of the trembling auditor. The sheer physical size of the mafia boss eclipsed the other man entirely, casting him in a dark, inescapable shadow. They chose the shipping routes, Richard. Dante stated softly. You are completely alone. There is no backup. There is no federal leverage. There is only the dark. The silver flash drive slipped from the violently shaking fingers, but it never hit the floor. Dante's large, scarred hand shot out with terrifying, blinding speed, snatching the titanium device out of midair. The movement was so fast, so incredibly precise, it made Richard flinch violently, throwing his arms up to protect his face in a pathetic display of cowardice. I watched the man who had tormented me for years cower like a frightened animal. The extreme safety fantasy was absolute. The monster was nothing more than a fragile, hollow shell standing before a true king. Dante slowly lowered his hand, slipping the drive into the inner pocket of his tuxedo. He then reached out, his massive hand gripping the lapels of Richard's meticulously tailored jacket. He didn't strike him. He simply lifted the auditor slightly off the polished stone floor, pressing him hard against the unyielding wall. Listen to me very carefully, because I will only explain the architecture of your new reality once, Dante growled, the civilized veneer completely stripped away, leaving only the lethal, terrifying sovereign. The woman standing behind you is my wife. She wears my family's shield. Every single breath you take from this moment forward is permitted strictly by my grace. If you ever speak her name again, if you ever look in her general direction, if you ever write a single line of code or a single ledger entry that references her existence, the underboss will not just kill you. Marco, standing perfectly still near the exit, unbuttoned his charcoal jacket with a slow, deliberate movement that revealed the matte black grip of his customized firearm. The silent threat was absolute. He will dismantle you, Dante promised, his voice a lethal, intimate whisper against the terrified man's ear. We will strip away your corporate assets, we will burn your public reputation to ash, and we will bury you in a foundation so deep the federal authorities will never find your bones. The law cannot protect you from a man who controls the shadows. Do you understand the contract we have just established, Mr. Thorne? Richard nodded frantically, his face completely devoid of color, his eyes wide with profound, mind-shattering terror. Tears of sheer panic spilled over his lashes, destroying the carefully constructed illusion of his patrician superiority. I understand. I swear to God. I understand. I will never touch her. I will disappear. Dante stared at the broken man for one long, agonizing second, letting the crushing gravity of the ultimatum brand itself permanently into his psyche. Then, with a look of absolute disgust, the mafia boss released his grip, letting the auditor collapse onto the polished stone floor, in a pathetic trembling heap. Get him out of my sight, Dante commanded. Not even looking down as he turned his back on the garbage at his feet, Marco stepped forward instantly, hauling the man up by the collar of his ruined tuxedo. Without a single word, the capo dragged the weeping, defeated auditor into the pitch-black abyss of the degraded limestone service corridor. The heavy mahogany panel slid shut behind them with a quiet, definitive click, sealing the breach in the perimeter and erasing Richard Thorne from the pristine, glittering world of the Grand Assembly Hall. The silence returned to the corridor, but it was no longer heavy or suffocating. It felt incredibly clear, scrubbed clean by the brutal, poetic justice that had just been administered. Dante turned to face me. The dark, terrifying fury that had consumed his features vanished, instantly replaced by that deep, mesmerizing warmth reserved exclusively for me. He closed the distance between us, his unreadable expression searching my face for any lingering signs of trauma, any microscopic fractures in my resolve. Are you unharmed, Clara? He asked softly, his large hands coming to rest gently on my velvet-clad waist, pulling me securely into his immense, radiating heat. I looked up at the man who had just dismantled my greatest fear using nothing but absolute authority and strategic brilliance. The phantom ache in my ribs was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, soaring sense of liberation. He hadn't just protected me, he had empowered me to face the nightmare and watch it break. I am completely intact, I whispered, lifting my left hand to rest against the crisp white fabric covering his broad chest, the massive heirloom pressed securely over his steady, beating heart. The foundation is solid, Dante. He let out a low, rough exhale, the sound vibrating with intense relief and undeniable burning affection. He lowered his head, his forehead resting gently against mine, bridging the final distance between us. The scent of aged whiskey and winter air wrapped around me, a permanent, unbreakable sanctuary. Then let us return to the ballroom, my queen, Dante murmured, his lips brushing agonizingly close to mine, sparking a desperate, electric heat that chased away the last shadows of the winter night. The commission is waiting to meet the woman who rules this empire. I smiled, a genuine, fearless expression, and took the arm of the most dangerous man in the city. The game was over. I had won. And as we walked back toward the blinding light and the soaring classical music, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never be invisible again. The transition back to the De Luca estate following the Grand Assembly Hall felt fundamentally different from any journey I had ever taken. We had left the sprawling, opulent cavern of marble and gold leaf behind, cutting through the freezing winter night in the back of the heavily armored SUV. The violent, poetic justice enacted in that secluded eastern corridor had scrubbed my mind clean of the paralyzing terror that had dictated my every movement for the past 6 months. Richard Thorne was no longer a looming specter of corporate manipulation and physical abuse. He was a broken, pathetic memory swallowed entirely by the dark. The ride was silent, but the quiet proved deceptive. It hung heavily pressurized with the intoxicating, undeniable reality of victory. The mechanical perfection of the vehicle moved with predatory grace over the icy asphalt, the reinforced tires humming a steady, grounding rhythm. Inside the cabin, the pressurized air smelled faintly of expensive leather and the crisp promise of impending snow. I was not the terrified fugitive who had sprinted through the rain just days prior. I was the Sovereign Protector's chosen partner, and the foundation we had built together was completely unbreakable. Upon crossing the threshold of the Beacon Hill penthouse, the warm, ambient lighting and the familiar scent of lavender and premium bourbon wrapped around me like a physical embrace. The adrenaline that had kept my posture rigid and my pulse steady throughout the gala was finally beginning to ebb, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. My body felt incredibly heavy, the midnight blue velvet gown suddenly feeling like a massive weight pulling me toward the floor. I hadn't realized how tightly I had been gripping the fabric of my own defense until the threat was permanently neutralized. The elaborate architectural facade I had maintained for the rival bosses was no longer necessary. I was safely behind the blast doors. Gemma Rossi was waiting in the grand foyer, her silver-streaked hair pulled back into its characteristic, immaculate bun, her dark eyes scanning my face with that sharp, highly observant, maternal intelligence. She did not ask how the evening had concluded. The absolute, unshakable calm radiating from Dante's massive frame as he stood beside me told her everything she needed to know. The operation had been a flawless success. "Come, Clara," Gemma murmured gently, stepping forward to take my arm, her touch a grounding tether to reality. "The adrenaline crash is a difficult tide to navigate. Let us get you out of that heavy velvet and check your healing skin." Dante released my hand, his calloused fingers lingering briefly against the heavy gold of the emerald signet ring. The brief contact sent a residual spark of electricity up my arm. "I have logistical matters to conclude in the tactical room with the security teams. I will join you in the master suite shortly." I offered him a soft, grounded nod, following the housekeeper down the quiet, secure corridors of the penthouse. Inside the master suite, the oppressive cold of the Boston winter was completely held at bay by the thick granite walls and the heated, hand-woven rugs. Gemma moved with her characteristic, practiced efficiency, helping me unfasten the hidden zipper of the heavy gown. The luxurious fabric slipped to the floor in a dark, liquid pool, taking the rigid, combative posture of the evening with it. She handed me the incredibly soft, dove-gray silk pajamas, waiting patiently as I dressed, before guiding me toward the plush velvet chaise lounge near the sprawling vanity. "You held your ground, child," Gemma observed, retrieving the pristine medical kit from the low-glass table. She opened it with a soft click, preparing a new chilled chamomile compress. The herbal scent immediately filled the air, a stark, calming contrast to the harsh cologne my ex-husband had worn. "The men downstairs are already whispering about the absolute steel in your spine. You did not just survive the gala, you conquered it." "I merely pointed out a structural flaw," I replied quietly, my voice raspy from the emotional exhaustion, though a small flicker of genuine pride warmed my chest. Dante and Marco executed the collapse. Gemma shook her head slightly, applying the soothing compress to the fading yellow bruises circling my left wrist. The icy relief seeped into the inflamed tissue, though the pain was now nothing more than a dull, distant memory. My analytical mind automatically cataloged the healing process the same way I would assess the stabilization of a fractured limestone cornice. The damage was still visible, a permanent map of the trauma, but the structural collapse had been definitively halted. "You provided the keystone," Gemma corrected softly. "Without your architectural insight, the enemy would have breached our defenses. You protected this family just as fiercely as the boss protected you." Before I could fully process the magnitude of her validation, a heavy, deliberate knock echoed against the solid core mahogany door. It was not Dante's familiar, possessive rhythm. It was a formal, tactical request for entry. Gemma stood up smoothly, opening the door just enough to verify the identity of the visitor. She stepped back, allowing Marco Moretti to to enter the intimate space of the master suite. The underboss was still wearing his impeccable charcoal suit, though the top button of his collar was undone, and the faint smell of cold winter air and gunpowder clung to the fine wool of his jacket. The lethal granite-carved mask he usually wore had softened infinitesimally. He did not step fully into the center of the room, maintaining a deeply respectful distance, his large hands resting at his sides. For a long, tense moment, the capo simply looked at me. I sat on the velvet chaise lounge, my bare feet sinking into the thick carpet, the chilled chamomile compress resting against my wrist. Days ago, this man had stood in a cathedral vestry and aggressively labeled me a catastrophic security risk, a civilian spy poised to tear their empire apart. I had been terrified of his dead eyes and his ruthless paranoia. Now Marco slowly unbuttoned his suit jacket, placing his right hand flat against his broad chest, directly over his heart. He bowed his head, a gesture of profound, absolute submission that sent a shockwave of realization through my tired mind. "I owe you a formal apology, ma'am," Marco stated, his gravelly voice devoid of its usual aggressive edge. He used the honorific with complete sincerity, the heavy subtext of the word solidifying my permanent elevation in the syndicate's hierarchy. "When you arrived at the cathedral, I assessed you as a liability. I questioned your presence, and I questioned the boss's judgment in granting you our family's shield. I was blind to the architecture of the situation. I only saw chaos where I should have seen a vital asset. I remained perfectly still, the sheer gravity of his words settling over me. In the criminal underworld, an underboss did not apologize to a civilian. They did not admit fault. For Marco to stand in my private quarters and formally retract his suspicion was a monumental shift in the syndicate's operational protocol. It was the ultimate professional validation. The auditor is secured in a holding facility far outside the city limits," Marco continued, his eyes rising to meet mine with stark, undeniable professional respect. "The silver flash drive has been decrypted and completely scrubbed. The federal leverage he held over you has been permanently erased. He will spend the rest of his natural life, breathing recycled air in a concrete box, completely isolated from the outside world. He will never balance another ledger, and he will never speak your name again." A massive, suffocating weight lifted off my chest, a physical release of tension that left me feeling incredibly light. The constant, gnawing fear of Richard's retribution had been the background radiation of my life for over a year. Now, it was simply gone, erased by the men standing in this fortress, dismantled by the very laws of the underworld Richard had foolishly tried to exploit. "You identified a critical blind spot in our perimeter," the underboss added, his tone reflecting a deep, tactical appreciation. "You saved our shipping lanes and you secured the transition of power. You are not a liability, Clara. You are the queen of this syndicate. If you ever require anything, if anyone in this city ever gives you a reason to doubt your safety, you have only to give me the order. We operate at your command." "Thank you, Marco," I said softly, my voice steady and clear. "I appreciate your diligence, and I appreciate you securing the perimeter tonight. We built a solid defense." Marco gave one final, deep nod, acknowledging the shared victory. "Rest well, ma'am." He turned on his heel and exited the room, his heavy footsteps fading down the quiet corridor. Gemma smiled warmly, finishing the application of a fresh white bandage over my wrist. "The respect of a capo is earned in blood or in brilliance. You gave them the latter. The estate is unequivocally yours." She gathered her medical supplies, offering a gentle pat on my shoulder before quietly leaving me alone in the sprawling suite. I sat in the profound silence, looking down at my hands. The striking family crest caught the soft ambient light of the bedside lamp. The transaction was complete. The fake marriage had successfully neutralized the political instability of the syndicate and completely dismantled my abusive ex-husband. According to the strict, clinical parameters of the contract I had signed in the sunlit study, the operation was over. The debt was settled. The secondary brace had held the load-bearing wall until the crisis passed. But as I looked at the vast, empty space of the master suite, absorbing the tactile luxury of the silk pajamas and the lingering scent of cedar, the thought of leaving this fortress felt like a structural collapse I could not survive. To walk away from the intoxicating scent of aged whiskey and the overwhelming, terrifying protection of Dante De Luca was fundamentally impossible. The extreme safety fantasy had morphed into a devastating, undeniable reality. I didn't want the contract to end. As I stared at the intricate geometric patterns woven into the antique rug, My mind meticulously categorized the events of the past 72 hours. I had entered the DeLuca Empire as a desperate, bleeding fugitive seeking a temporary shield from a storm. I had expected to be used, discarded, or at best, tolerated as a necessary inconvenience by violent men who viewed women as collateral. Instead, I had found a sovereign protector who treated my trauma with astonishing, localized gentleness. Dante had covered my shivering shoulders with his own bespoke cashmere coat. He had personally applied cold compresses to the violet fingerprints bruising my skin. He had weaponized his entire, terrifying criminal organization to ensure the man who hurt me would never see the light of day again. He had handed me the architecture of my own revenge and watched with dark, possessive pride as I executed it. The absolute silence in the room was abruptly broken by the distinctive heavy click of the solid core mahogany door. I looked up, my pulse giving a familiar, erratic flutter that had absolutely nothing to do with fear. Dante DeLuca stepped into the master suite, his massive frame absorbing the dim light. He had discarded his charcoal overcoat and unfastened the bow tie of his formal tuxedo, letting the black silk hang loose around the unbuttoned collar of his crisp white dress shirt. The dark, intricate ink of his syndicate tattoos was faintly visible at his throat, a stark contrast to the civilized tailoring. He looked incredibly exhausted, the deep, permanent shadows beneath his cloudy gaze more pronounced after the high-stakes tactical maneuvering of the gala. Yet, the lethal magnetic aura surrounding him was undiminished. He was the heavy, primary beam holding up the weight of the entire ceiling, dark and unyielding in the dim light. He closed the door firmly, locking the rest of the syndicate out, and walked slowly toward the center of the room. In his right hand he held a thick cream-colored dossier. It was the same premium, watermarked folder he had presented to me in the private study the morning after our fake wedding. The cold air trapped inside my chest turned to solid stone. The contract. Dante stopped a few feet away from the velvet chaise lounge, his intense gaze sweeping over my soft silk pajamas and the fresh white bandage securing my wrist. He looked down at the heavy folder in his hand, his jaw tightening as a microscopic muscle twitched beneath his skin. The civilized veneer of the mafia boss seemed incredibly fragile in the quiet intimacy of the bedroom. The unspoken tension between us thickened, heavy and suffocating, buzzing with the electric reality of what that document represented. The rival faction has officially conceded the eastern shipping routes, Dante stated, his deep baritone vibrating with a low, gravelly resonance that reverberated right through the floorboards. The commission witnessed the absolute failure of their infiltration, and they witnessed you standing flawlessly at my side. The transition of power is completely ratified. No one will ever question the stability of the DeLuca syndicate again. I swallowed hard, wrapping my arms loosely around my ribs in a lingering instinct of self-preservation. My fingers dug into the soft silk. And Richard? He has been permanently relocated to a subterranean facility, Dante answered, his voice dropping to a level of cold, absolute finality. The silver flash drive, the encrypted titanium drive that once held my past, was destroyed. Every fabricated ledger he created to frame you has been digitally scrubbed from the federal servers by our internal assets. You are entirely free, Clara. The threat has been eradicated down to the foundation. He took another step forward, the sheer physical size of him casting a protective shadow over my seated form. He held up the cream-colored dossier, the crisp black ink of the legal jargon hidden within its pages demanding acknowledgement. This document, Dante murmured, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that stripped away all the oxygen in the room. This legally binding contract dictated the precise parameters of our arrangement. It was a transaction. You offered me the optics of a unified front, and in exchange, I offered you a fortress to hide within. I stared at the heavy paper, a profound, aching sorrow blooming in my chest. In the corporate world, when a contract fulfilled its purpose, the partnership was formally dissolved. The assets were divided, the ledgers balanced, and the individuals walked away. I had spent years desperately trying to escape the binding legal documents Richard had used to trap me. Now, the thought of this specific contract ending felt like having the ground ripped out from under my feet. I didn't want my freedom if it meant leaving this room. I understand, I whispered, my voice a fragile, fractured sound in the quiet space. I forced myself to maintain eye contact, refusing to let him see the devastation threatening to shatter my composure. The debt is settled, I can pack my things in the morning. I will not be a burden to your household any longer. Dante froze. The absolute sudden stillness of his massive frame was infinitely more terrifying than any sudden, violent movement. His storm gray eyes darkened, a flash of genuine, devastating pain fracturing his stoic facade. He stared at me as if I had just driven a physical blade directly into his chest. The silence stretched, incredibly taut, echoing with the sheer weight of my misguided assumption. "A burden?" he repeated, the words tearing out of his throat in a raw, gravelly rasp. Before I could even process the sudden shift in the atmosphere, Dante closed the remaining distance between us. He didn't sit down on the velvet chaises. He stood towering over me, his broad chest rising and falling in a rapid, perfectly controlled rhythm. He looked down at the cream-colored dossier in his hand, his aristocratic features hardening into an expression of absolute, unyielding resolve. With a sudden violent motion, Dante gripped the thick stack of premium, watermarked paper, and tore it entirely in half. The sharp tearing sound of the heavy paper echoed loudly in the silent room, a shocking, destructive act that made my eyes widen in absolute disbelief. He didn't stop. He layered the torn halves and ripped them again, systematically destroying the meticulous legal document his attorneys had drafted. He tore the contract into meaningless, chaotic shreds, rendering the indemnities and the boundaries entirely void. He let the ruined pieces fall from his large hands, scattering them like snow onto the immaculate rug at our feet. "The contract is dead," Dante growled, his voice dipping into a level of profound, desperate vulnerability that shook the very air around us. He dropped the last remaining scrap of paper, his large, scarred hands reaching out to gently frame my face. His thumbs brushed incredibly lightly across my cheekbones, the calloused texture of his skin sending a massive electric shock straight down my spine. The tactile contrast between his violent destruction of the document and the staggering gentleness of his touch short-circuited every defensive mechanism I had left. "I did not bring you into my home to balance a ledger, Clara," he murmured, his storm-gray eyes burning with a dark, consuming and fiercely possessive fire. "I did not wrap my coat around your shivering shoulders in that cathedral, because I needed a political prop. The moment I saw you standing in the rain, bleeding and terrified but refusing to shatter, the architecture of my entire world shifted. The transition of power was an excuse to keep you." I leaned infinitesimally into his touch, my hands coming up to rest against the crisp, white fabric covering his heavy musculature. The steady, rhythmic pounding of his heart beneath my palms was the most beautiful, structurally sound thing I had ever felt. "You walked into a room full of monsters and handed me the blueprint to destroy them," Dante continued, his forehead coming to rest gently against mine, bridging the final, agonizing distance between us. His breathing was shallow, mirroring the frantic rhythm of my own. "You didn't hide behind my guns. You sharpened them. You belong in this empire. You belong in this house." The intoxicating scent of aged whiskey and the overwhelming, crisp winter air enveloped me completely, driving out the last lingering ghosts of my past. The man holding me was a ruthless sovereign, a predator who dealt in absolute violence and dark money. But the emotional safety he provided was profoundly, undeniably pure. He wasn't building a cage, he was offering me a throne. The situational irony was staggering. My absolute freedom was found within the walls of a criminal fortress. "I am not asking you to be my fake bride anymore," Dante stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that completely shattered his impenetrable armor. The unspoken tension that had hummed between us since the moment we met at the altar finally snapped. "I'm not asking you to love the criminal. I am asking if you can love the whole complicated mess of who I actually am." Tears of sheer, unadulterated relief spilled over my lashes, sliding down my cheeks to wet his calloused thumbs. I had spent 6 months running from a man who used the law to mask his cruelty. I had stumbled blindly into the arms of a man who broke every law in existence just to keep me safe. I didn't need to be invisible anymore. "Yes," I whispered, the single word echoing with absolute, unshakable certainty. I slid my arms around his broad, muscular neck, my fingers tangling in the dark hair at the nape of his neck, the heavy gold of the emerald signet ring pressed securely against his skin, a permanent brand of our shared destiny. "I will stay, Dante. I want to stay." A rough, desperate sound tore from his throat. He didn't hesitate any longer. Dante captured my lips with his, a kiss that was entirely devoid of the careful, strict restraint he had maintained for the past 3 days. It was a kiss of absolute possession, a fierce, consuming demand that tasted of dark whiskey, overwhelming heat, and the permanent, unbreakable sanctuary I had finally found. I kissed him back with equal, desperate fervor, all the unspoken tension and delayed biological longing exploding in a single, devastating collision. He wrapped his massive arms around my waist, lifting me effortlessly from the velvet chaise lounge, holding me so tightly against his solid frame that our heartbeats synchronized into one powerful driving rhythm. When he finally pulled back, we were both breathless, the air in the master suite humming with a dense electric gravity. Dante looked down at me, his storm gray eyes softened into a mesmerizing, protective warmth that I knew belonged exclusively to me. He carried me toward the massive, floor-to-soiling windows, the thick, bulletproof glass separating us from the freezing Boston winter. Outside, the snow continued to fall, coating the historic architecture of Beacon Hill in a pristine, blinding white, muffling the chaotic world beyond our reinforced walls. The sprawling, dangerous city below was silent, unaware of the tectonic shifts that had just occurred in its darkest shadows. Tomorrow would bring its own complex challenges. There would be new syndicates to navigate, new threats Marco would have to mitigate, and new treacherous politics we would have to manage together. The criminal underworld was a volatile, unforgiving environment, and the crown I had accepted was heavy. But right now, wrapped completely in Dante's immense, radiating heat, my head resting securely against his chest while we looked out over the sparkling skyline, I knew the structural foundation of my life was finally, permanently secure. The scars Richard had left on my wrists, and my ribs would eventually fade into white, permanent marks, a biological map of the trauma I had survived. They no longer defined me. They were simply the rugged, reinforced masonry that had led me here, to this exact moment, to this profoundly beautiful sanctuary. My professional mind had spent a lifetime studying how to save broken things from collapse, but it took crashing a mafia wedding, by mistake, to realize that true safety was not the absence of danger. True safety was finding a fortress built on mutual trust, professional respect, and a love fierce enough to rewrite your scars. The debt was settled. The old ledgers were permanently closed. And as the sovereign protector pulled me tighter against his side, shielding me from the cold glass, I knew that for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving, I was winning. And our true story was just getting started.